Welcome again. Zola Levitt with you, and welcoming you to our course on Jewish history. This is an important course. There's lots of information here. Take your notes carefully. You know, this is the history of the people that God picked out. It's different than the history of any other people, and for one thing, right off the bat, it's longer. There are no people functioning in the world today older than the Jewish people in the sense of the same culture, the same religion. People that can claim an ancestor of 4,000 years stand really pretty much alone. Now, you might say the Chinese or a culture like that that's been off by itself is that old or older. It might be in time, but it's changed cultures, it's changed gods, it's changed music, it's changed its holy writ time and time again. The Jewish people stand alone in the world as coming all the way, let's say, from the Sinai to the present day with the same law. The Jewish law is the only international law in the whole world. There's no other. It would depend what jurisdiction you're in, what punishment you get for driving drunk or killing somebody. It just depends what country, what state you're in. Under Jewish law, it doesn't matter what country you're in. The rabbinical law would take precedence. In other words, this is a culture that's something to be learned about and something to be appreciated. There's some events in Jewish history that almost stand alone for courage of religious people, which, you know, soldiers in any religious army should be proud of. Christians could take a lesson from say the Maccabean revolt when Antiochus controlled Israel in 170 BC, and over ensuing years the Maccabees got up a successful revolt against an enormously strong power that was well entrenched in the country, and somehow threw them out, creating the festival of dedication, the Feast of Hanukkah, which Jesus celebrated. Was not part of Torah, but in John 10:22 it says he went down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. He was thrilled by that. Standing almost alone in history is the idea of Masada, the wonderful story of the Jewish people who climbed that mountain out in the wilderness and surrounded by a legion of Roman soldiers stubbornly stuck to the top of that hill. And when the Romans had built a ramp and gone up there, went to so much trouble to get them off of there, those 960-some people, they found all suicides. They would sooner have killed themselves than be dominated by a foreign power. The whole world comes to see Masada because of that pristine moment in 70 A.D. The Warsaw Ghetto in World War II, a similar story where the ghetto wasn't much, and it wasn't fun to live in, but it was their territory, and despite the entire Nazi war machine, they would defend even the sewers, and they did that. The '67 war, in which Israel battled nation after nation on every border, and in 6 days recovered the holy city, the entire Sinai. It was unthinkably, people talk about the stunning upsets in professional football. This is probably the most stunning upset in history. A tiny nation of a few tens of thousands of troops versus the entire Arab world, in effect, coming down on them and doing such a beautiful job. The War of Independence itself in 1948, with people fighting with hunting rifles and hand pistols against disciplined uniformed armies with their might and their weaponry and their motorized vehicles and so on. Somehow they have always survived. This is the story of the people of the book. The reason they survive is because of God, and they are the best proof of God's existence, that they're just could be anywhere. This is God's greatest project in terms of a people, that he chose them that long ago, and that he's going to see it through and fulfill this promise right to the end. The fact that there are Jewish people among us is a proof that this holy book, out of all holy books, is the true one. You know, if we think back to that time in the Sinai, when the Exodus from Egypt, the Hebrew people were one of 100 marauding tribes out there, and everybody was the chosen people as far as they were concerned. They all had gods. They all had holy writ. They all had a law. If you were guessing then which would survive, the last you'd pick would be this motley group of slaves, untrained to live out there with no government, with no army, marching around carrying this fantastic tabernacle, this unbelievable thing, from place to place, and somehow scratching for a few drops of water and some shelter and some food every night for 40 years. You wouldn't pick them. You would pick the Hittites. You would pick the Egyptians. You would pick somebody else. Must really be the chosen people, because these people have no chance. And you come down some 3,500 years later, and stubbornly they are hanging on. Again, singing the same songs, reading the same Bible, singing the same hymns, and keeping the same festivals. This is unprecedented in human history, and it's the reason why we want you to look at this. It's part of understanding the Bible. Without the Bible, there are no Jews, in effect. There's just a political entity. With the Bible, there's a people with a land grant, with a significant law, with the story of creation, with the 7-day week, with a lot of inventions the whole world takes for granted that God gave exclusively to them. Now, there are books in the Bible that deal with the history of the Jewish people, and we saw this in our survey of the Old Testament. But the story doesn't end with the close of the Old Testament or the New, and in this course we'll continue the story for you. And of course it doesn't end here either. The 1,000-year kingdom of the future is to be in Israel. And so this people is a standard, a characteristic of God's plan for the whole world for all time. We'll cover the history of the Jewish people from the pages of the Bible to the pages of our current newspapers, from the past to the present. And later on in our studies, we'll deal with the future of Israel according to prophecy. It was a theme back in Daniel's time to prophesy about the destiny of the Jewish people. Daniel had a vision, a statue. The various parts of the statue represented the parts of they represented kingdoms that would rule the whole world. And when God interpreted the dream, the dream was of Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel was called to interpret it. And when he interpreted it, it predicted right in order the world-conquering kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so it happened. And Rome is the last one, and we're going to point out in prophecy how a revived Roman Empire will be the final oppressor of Israel before God starts the kingdom in the world. The statue is related coming governments and established the idea that there was in the world something outside of the scriptural precepts that guided the destinies of men. It kept an eye on the devil, you might say. It saw what the enemy was doing, and we're going to do that too. A lot of this information will be new to you, and when you think back to how you retained the biblical data that we gave you, then this is the same kind of memory event. Listen to the tapes carefully, take your notes. It may require a different effort or more effort on your part to retain these lessons, but keep in mind you're studying one of God's great projects. Listen to the tape a few times. Keep your notes, review them, keep them for the future. Make use of the charts that have been provided. We really want you to know this. Some love history and others don't, but in any case, to know the history of this central biblical people is just very important for any believer. This is an institute of Jewish and Christian studies, and so Jewish history is a natural in the study of the Jewish people. So in a moment you'll be hearing from Jeff on Jewish history, but first let's pray that God will bless us. We undertake the task of learning about the history of His chosen people. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, guide us as we look into one of your great projects. You chose a people You've stuck with your promises through thick and thin, through irreverence, through separation, through dispersion. And we who are alive today are immensely privileged to see the people restored to their land and to see the promises of prophecy move forward. So, Lord, guide us and be with us, clear our minds, and enable us to understand the history of the people you chose. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, a hearty shalom to all of you. My name is Jeffrey Seif, and I will be leading you through your study of Jewish history. I might add, I think it's a very, very significant study. It's a very important study, and I'll tell you why. When we look at Jewish history, what are we looking at, really? In a sense, what we're doing is we're looking at fulfilled Bible prophecy. For that matter, when we're looking at prophecy, what are we looking at? We're looking at history before it's written. And so it is that some people wonder, what's the purpose and point of a study of Jewish history? Well, I think it's very important for one reason to understand how prophecy is fulfilled, and we can see God the way He's working with His people, the Jews. Please remember that we have what's called the Institute of Jewish Christian Studies. So we're getting right to the heart of Jewish studies here, and we're going to be seeing the history of the Jewish people. And I want to begin from the beginning of Jewish history, which of course goes back to the Bible, and take it all the way to the present. So we have an ambitious task ahead of us in our study of Jewish history. I would please suggest that you take notes, because we are going to require that you have this information. And you're going to be doing some research, a research paper, answering some questions, a quiz or two, and you're going to need to have this information. And it's my good pleasure to sit here in the seat to dispense it to you. So let's just begin right away. And of course, if you have been in our Old Testament survey, if you have listened to that, then you're acquainted with the beginnings of Jewish history. Of course, it all begins in the book of beginnings, which is Genesis, or in Hebrew, Bereshit, which means beginnings. And we saw how, among other things, the Old Testament, the First Testament, traces God's dealings with the Jewish people. We see the birth of the Jewish nation in Genesis chapter 12 with Abram, how God calls Abram out and says that I'm going to make of you a great nation. And we follow the development of that nation through the Old Testament scriptures. We see how there was Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, one of which was Joseph. Now Joseph, because of his jealous brothers, and he did some things to incite that jealousy, to further instigate it, but that's another story. We see how his brothers, through jealousy, sold Joseph to a caravan as a slave, and off Joseph went in the land of Egypt. They meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. And we see in the book of Genesis how God raised up Joseph to a prominent statue in the land of Egypt. And finally what happens is a famine breaks out in the land of Canaan, and his brothers are forced into Egypt to buy grain. And there in Egypt they become reunited with Joseph, and we find out how in the close of the book of Genesis, this family clan of 70 or 75 Jews moves into Egypt. Well, what happens eventually in the book of Exodus, we see the story how Joseph is dead and Pharaoh's dead, and the Egyptian authorities that are friendly to the Jews are dead. And finally, what happens is a Pharaoh comes along who knows not the Lord, knows not the Jews, knows not Joseph, and what he does is he puts them to hard labor. And hundreds of years go by, and the Jewish people cry out for redemption. And finally, God sends Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. Moses is God's man for the hour, and God works through him to bring freedom for the Jewish people, and Moses leads them out of Egypt through the wilderness, eventually to the promised land. Moses himself never enters that land. He dies prior to entry, but what he does is he appoints Joshua as God's man in his stead. And Joshua leads the people across the Jordan and into the promised land, where they knock out the main power bases of the Canaanite peoples. Remember that when the Israelites got to the promised land, the Canaanites didn't roll out a red carpet and say, we've been waiting for you to come and be the overlords of this land. No, there was war. And Joshua was the military leader who knocks out the main power bases of the Canaanite peoples. And Moses is Joshua is an old man as the book of Joshua comes to a close. And what he does is he divvies up the land, and each of the tribes go to their respective inheritance, the land apportioned to them, and the book of Joshua comes to a close, and then we come to Judges, a dark hour in Jewish history, where people forget all about what Joshua taught them and what Moses taught them, and instead of following God, they had other ideas. Instead of getting rid of paganism, they decided to adopt it into part of their practice. They inculcated it into their worship, and bingo, they hit the rocks quick. They backslid. It's a dark hour in history where the Jewish people, by and large, were disobedient towards God, and God caused tsuris and difficulties to overtake them. Difficulties in the form of the neighboring peoples would overtake them and become their overlords, and the Jews were subservient to the Midianites and subservient to the Philistines and what have you. And what would happen is that these overlords of theirs who were placed there because of their rebellion would make life so difficult the Jews would cry for relief and redemption. And here again, in his mercy, God sent people to deliver. We didn't have the super charismatic type figures of Moses or Abraham, but God raised up people known as judges who served as leaders at the time. And we looked at some of those judges. We're familiar with Gideon was one for a season, as was Samson. We're all familiar with the story of Samson. And the last of those judges was a fellow named Samuel. Now, the reason why we needed so many judges is what would happen is that a judge would come to power and he would drive out the foreign oppressor. And then what would happen would be that when he would die, the people would go back to their sinful ways again. There'd be something like a revival, whereas when the judge would come to power, people would sort of get their act together and look to God again. But when he died, they'd just go their merry own way, and bingo, they were in the same shape again. In the period of Judges, they just couldn't seem to learn their lesson. Now, the last of these judges, the last of these leaders, was a fellow named Samuel, and Samuel was very instrumental because he did something which was, well, what he did was he ordained the first king, who was Saul. And we get to the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. We read about Saul's temporary seat on the throne, and it was temporary because he became disobedient, such that God said this man has to go. And David was anointed, the shepherd boy, and we read in the book of 1 Samuel the descend of Saul and the ascent of David, how God worked that out. David didn't manipulate for his power. Many a person should learn a lesson from that, however, it's God's will that someone sits in a place of authority. God seems to bring him there. We don't have to manipulate and maneuver, and it's a good lesson in the book of Samuel. Well, David comes to power, and we read about the beginnings of the monarchy with Saul and David. David, of course, dies, and his son Solomon comes to power, and Solomon is sitting on the throne of Israel, and he builds the temple. His son rules after Solomon's death, and there's a civil war. There's all sorts of problems. In the year 725, the king of Assyria comes down and destroys the northern kingdom, and in the year 605, the southern kingdom goes as well. Actually, there were a few times when the Babylonians exported Jews to the land of Babylon. Now, our study of Jewish history begins really at that Babylonian captivity. Of course, ultimately it begins in the days of Scripture, and I just tried to recap quickly in about 7 minutes the whole span of Jewish history in the Bible. And I certainly think that our study of Old Testament survey will suffice to do that more than adequately. Here our purposes is to begin looking at other areas of Jewish history, beginning with the Babylonian captivity, but tracing us through modern times. And we're dividing it into 3 periods of time. The first is the formation of Judaism, the formation of Jewish history, I should say here, from the year 400 to 500 AD, 400 BCE to 500 AD. Now you say, wait a minute, what's BCE? Well, it's the Jewish designation for it. BCE means before the Common Era. And so from 400 BC to 500 AD is the formation. Secondly is the development of Jewish history, of the Jewish people, of Judaism, from 500 to 1800. And thirdly, present or modern Jewish history from 1800 to the present. Please, let's begin now with looking at some events that took place following the exile. Again, just to recap here, Assyria comes down and takes the northern kingdom captive, destroys them, wreaks havoc, deals a severe blow to the northern kingdom in the year 725. In the year 605, Judah is sacked. Jerusalem is razed to the ground. We read the book of Lamentations where the people are lamenting the destruction of the temple, and the Jewish people are taken away captive into Babylon. The messianic line, the Davidic throne is finished here in a sense. And what happens is that why do we go through this? What's the reason for the exile? Well, we can read in the books of Israel and in the books of Hosea and Amos where they're prophesying to the northern kingdom. God says, if you don't repent, bingo, judgment's coming to you. And that's referring to Assyria. And we, looking in our study of Old Testament survey, we remembered there were various prophets who prophesied exclusively to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and said, if you don't repent, then you're going to get it too. What was the problem with the southern kingdom? The problem was rebelliousness. They wouldn't listen to God, and rebelliousness took a form of idolatry. Instead of worshiping one God, people started making other gods as well. Instead of getting rid of the idols in the land, they inculcated them into their worship. And so it is that it was a polluted, a perverted kind of Judaism which had to go. And as a result, off they went for a period of purging into exile. Why was Judah exiled? Again, because of idolatry, religious corruption, and the like. There were various sins that had to go. And by the way, since then, you don't find Jewish people worshiping idols. Many Jewish people don't know much about Judaism and certainly don't know much about the Hebrew language, but everybody knows this expression, which goes, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It means, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, a lot of Jewish people don't know a lot about Judaism, but everybody knows that the Jew believes in one God. And that point was hammered home during the exile. Well, what else happened during the exile besides the period of purging? Now, put yourself in the place of a Jewish person who was taken away captive. Now, what's missing from your life? You can be your husband, the husband can be there with the wife, and the kids can be there in Babylon, and they can still be looking to God, but something's missing. I'll tell you what's missing. The temple is missing. When we look at the Judaism and the law of Moses and the Judaism today, there's a difference. In the law of Moses, in the Torah, there's things like sacrifice. We look at the book of Leviticus, it's all about sacrifice. Various kinds of sacrifices and offerings and the like. It talks about the temple worship, and none of that exists now. It doesn't exist for the Jews during the Babylonian captivity, and it doesn't exist for Jewish people today. So Jewish people no longer had a central point. They had that in the southern kingdom. They had the temple there in Jerusalem, which people would go to. And during the period of the United Monarchy, when there was no civil war and the northern and the southern kingdoms were together, all the Jews from all over would come to Jerusalem to worship. But now they didn't have that central focal point. They didn't have that institution that would encourage learning and study of Torah and the worship of Jehovah. It didn't exist. So this new phenomenon occurred during the exile, which was the development of the synagogue. Synagogue isn't a place where we offer sacrifices. It's a shul. It's a school. And in the synagogue, the Jewish learning continued. Jewish learning continued in the synagogue. Things happen in Babylon. Of course, we know the story of Daniel. There he is in the king's court during the captivity. And Daniel has a vision, by the way. How long is this captivity going to last for the people? And when's the Messiah going to come, etc.? In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel has a vision about the statue with a head of gold and the arms and the breast of this and silver, etc. He has a vision which serves as a beautiful painting, a beautiful prophecy of the history of the intertestamental period. In fact, critics of Daniel want to say that Daniel was written much, much closer to Christ. They're saying that Daniel wrote history because it is such an accurate piece of history that Daniel's writing. They're saying that Daniel, first of all, didn't write the book of Daniel. The Daniel wasn't written by someone taken away captive in Babylon. Daniel was written by a guy around the 2nd century BC. That's what the liberal theologians want to say, and the reason is it's beautiful history. Daniel gives the whole picture of intertestamental events, and he speaks about this statue, and you can read it in Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to be getting into this in prophecy. I don't want to get into it much here, but what happens is Daniel is captive in Babylon, and what happens is that in the year 539, Babylon falls. It's weakened, and Cyrus, of the Persian and Median Empire is now sitting on the throne. There's no longer a Babylon or a Babylonian throne. And what Cyrus does in 539 is he decrees that the Jews can return from captivity. And in our Old Testament survey, we looked at how Jeremiah predicted that this would last for 70 years, this captivity. And so it was that after that due course of time, God in his omnipotence, who arranges and moves around the nations and governments of this world, what happens is it was time for them to go, and Cyrus comes to power, the Babylonians fall, the Persians rise, and the Jews are permitted to return. And we read about the returnings of the Jewish people. We read about in Ezra, Ezra who was the spiritual leader, and Nehemiah who came after Ezra, who returned from Babylon and went to the promised land to begin rebuilding. Well, what happens is that in the year 333, Alexander the Great comes to Asia Minor, and he has a score to settle. And what happens is that the Persians fall, and now in the year 331, Alexander the Great gains control of the land of Israel. We're familiar with the story of Alexander the Great, how as a young man he conquered what was then the whole known world. And I'll tell you something about Alexander the Great. When he would conquer, he wouldn't just conquer the people. He wouldn't just tax them and what have you. When Alexander the Great took over a land, he would really force the Greek culture on the peoples of that land, with the purpose being to create like one world empire. He wanted to inculcate his culture everywhere. And so it is that we see the rise of Hellenism, it's called, in the land of Israel. Hellenism. Now what happens is we find certain things emerging in the land of Israel that weren't there beforehand. And these things show how the Greek culture was taking root in the land. We see the beginnings of the Greek theaters, chariot races. In fact, there was we find by the time of Christ this big chariot race place in Jerusalem. If you've seen the movie Ben-Hur, you know what that's talking about. Gymnasiums began occurring. Stadiums were built. The marketplace took on a very Greek form. And so it is that when Alexander the Great conquered, that he didn't just conquer a people, he conquered a culture and impressed his own upon them. And now here we have a real clash, because we have assimilation versus tradition. There were many Jewish people who were saying, well, look, here we are beneath Alexander the Great. These are modern times, and instead of just holding to our old ways, we need to realize this is a modern day and age in which we live and give up some of these traditions which are keeping us in shackles. And some Jews were saying that, and many, many other Jews were saying, wait a minute, no, we are the people of the book, the Bible. And God commanded us to eat certain foods, to do certain things, and to live a certain way. And these Greeks are here having nude athletic events and nude gymnasium discus throwing and what have you. Wait a minute, that's not us. These public bathhouses that they have, wait a minute, we are a very strict, religious, God-fearing people, and we're not going to give in to this sort of thing. So that tension existed, but it really doesn't rise to proportions under Alexander as it does later on in time. Well, Alexander the Great dies young, and his empire is divided up. In the year 323, his generals, four main generals in particular, are fighting. What happened is Alexander's empire, the Greek empire, was divided up amongst those generals. Now, we're interested in two of them in particular, the first being Ptolemies of Egypt, who, by the way, who had control of the land of Israel from the year 323 till 198 BCE. Now what happens is that we see in 198, a little bit before that, a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And he, as Ptolemies was the general who had control of Egypt and that whole region, Antiochus Epiphanes was the Syrian. He was from there, and he was at war with Egypt. He was at war with Egypt, and Epiphanes needed something, as any general needs when he's at war. If you're a general and you were at war, there's something you must do. And I wouldn't advise being late. You know what you have to do? You have to pay the troops. You have to buy armaments. They don't take IOUs. So what happens is that Epiphanes has this wonderful idea. He says, well, why don't we sack the temple? Now, if you look at a map and see where Syria is, and if you look at a map and if you look and see where Egypt is, you'll notice that there's a little parcel of land that really stands in the way. If any Syrian general is going to go to Egypt, there's someone he has to pass through. And you guessed it, that's the land of Israel. In fact, there are various reasons why it has been such a tense spot throughout all of history, and one of the reasons is it is so perfectly strategically located. All the overland trade routes from Europe and everything over into Africa, it all passes through Israel. And today, of course, is the Suez Canal, the main shipping lines. We're not far from the Persian oil fields and what have you. There's a lot of reasons why it's such an important area. But here, Epiphanes, on his war with Egypt, has to go through Israel. And what does he find in Israel? He finds this temple that, remember, had been rebuilt. When they came back from captivity, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, but in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, that temple was rebuilt. And what happens, they have this rebuilt temple. Now, what happened in the temple? Well, of course, people worship God there. And you know what else they do there? They'd use the temple as a big bank. People would put their savings and what have you. They'd store it in depositories in the temple. Why would they do that? Well, let's face it, from an old Jewish point of view, from an ancient point of view, that's the safest place in the world to put your money. People aren't going to come and rob God. No Jew would think of going and robbing God's house. I mean, that is too much to stomach for any decent kind of person. Well, it wasn't too much for Antiochus Epiphanes to stomach. He wanted money, and he figured right that he could get it there. And so what he does is he comes and he sacks the temple. And Antiochus Epiphanes now takes control of the land of Israel. And in the year 167 BCE, what does he do? He suspends temple worship. Not only does he suspend it, what he does is he goes and he offers pigs in the Holy of Holies. That he sacrifices pigs in there, and he sets up a type of abomination which makes desolate. He does some disgusting things, and of course Daniel has a few words to say about that. And again, that event, the whole abomination which makes desolate, applies to end times events as well, but it touches upon history during the intertestamental period. Daniel is not silent prophetically about this pig Antiochus Epiphanes, who comes into the temple and makes the temple, the Holy of Holies, the temple, now a temple to Zeus. He doesn't suspend temple worship, just suspend it. He really desecrates the temple. And he makes it illegal to eat kosher foods. He makes it illegal to study Torah. He makes it illegal to obey the Sabbath. And he makes it illegal to circumcise your children. It was just plain against the law to be a Jew. Antiochus Epiphanes realized that the strength of the Jewish people was in their religion, and he really sought out to destroy it. And so it is that the Jewish people were subjected to the hard yoke of Antiochus Epiphanes. But, of course, discontent was in the air, and people just certainly couldn't tolerate this. And finally, what happens is there's a revolt, headed by what we know as the Maccabees, which is a word that means hammer. And in the year 165, the Syrians are defeated, the temple is retaken, and the Jewish people under Judah Maccabee, they go and they retake the temple from the Syrians. The revolt wins, and they go in there to cleanse the temple and rededicate it. And that is the story of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, or as some call it, the Feast of Lights, because they rededicated the temple, and there was a miracle there that this oil burnt for 8 days. It was only supposed to burn for 7, and it lit the menorah, and they reinstituted temple worship again. Well, what happens is Syria weakens, not just because of their defeats to the Jews, but because of defeats elsewhere. Syria is on the lame. It becomes a weak government, and the Jewish people are able to negotiate with them finally for various freedoms and the like. And before you know it, we don't see Syria anymore. And from the year 128 BC to 64, we really have freedom in the land of Israel. That there's no longer really a foreign power that's doing Israel dirty. But just the Jewish people, we just really can't seem to get our act together during that period of time. There's a lot of division in the country, a lot of parties, religious parties, political parties, parties that wanted to assimilate into the Greco-Roman culture, parties that wanted to remain loyal to Judaism, parties that wanted peace, parties that wanted war, and it was scattered and just couldn't really get their act together. Judea, Israel, was a real scattered piece of real estate. And what happens finally? In the year 66 BC, what happens there is Rome appears in Damascus. You bet. We've heard of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Well, Rome's on the rise here now, and they are the power to deal with. Once upon a time in Jewish history, you had to deal with the Babylonians, and the Babylonians fell. And then the people to deal with were the Persians, and then the Persians fell. And then the people to deal with were the Greeks, and the Greeks fell. And then the Syrians, and the Syrians fell. And now it's Rome. In the year of 66 BC, Rome is in Damascus. And in 66, of course, Rome really gains complete control. There's not much debate. They're so big and so powerful. What Caesar wants, Caesar gets. And such was the case that Rome were now the lords over Judea. And of course, Rome did a few things. We've heard about Herod. Herod was Rome's puppet piece in the land of, in a part of the land of Israel, and he was a real wicked person. There's an old saying that goes, "It was safer to be Herod's son than it was to be his pig." He was a maniac. He was cruel, and he was part Jewish, by the way. And he was an overlord for a season, but he really had to answer to Rome. Now, there were different Jewish factions during the Roman occupation, that people that really weren't especially satisfied with what was going on. And let me just introduce you to some of these factions. We've heard of the Zealots. The Zealots are mentioned in the New Testament. These are very political-minded people that really just have a certain zeal and an enthusiasm and believe that God was with their cause and that these people were going to drive out the Romans, period. These were real Green Berets, these people. These people wanted to fight, and enough is enough, and just couldn't stand Rome's presence. And if you go to Israel and you get into archaeology somewhat, you can see how Rome, right next to the temple, they built their big headquarters for their garrisons and what have you. Jewish people didn't like to be subjected to Rome, and the Zealots were the people that were bidding, let's drive them out. Well, there were other people that were discontent. There was the Essenes, and their big gripe wasn't with the Romans per se. Their gripe was with the Jewish religious leaders. They were themselves, many of them, ex-priests, and these were people who were really unhappy with the state of affairs in the land of Israel. They didn't like the corruption that they found in Jerusalem. When I say corruption, I'm talking about what was happening in the time of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Essenes were kind of an eccentric kind of group. They went out into the wilderness and they had their own communities. And we hear of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which come from the Qumran community, which was an Essene community. These were Essenes in there, and they preserve for us the scrolls. And it's beautiful. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls are so significant because they really exonerate conservative Bible scholars. We see books in the Bible in whole form in the Old Testament, and they really are the oldest manuscripts, and they line up so beautifully with our current manuscripts of the Scriptures. They really show us that what we have in our Bibles, if you sit down and open up your Bible right now, you can have confidence that what you're reading really is what was written way back then. It really is God's Word that He, in His majesty, has preserved over the years. Well, the Essenes were really wrapped up in, they had certain doctrines. The doctrines of light versus darkness was one of their big things, and we can talk about this later on in our study of the intertestamental period. We'll be looking at them more closely. The Essenes believed in no slaves and not taking oaths. They were very much into bathing, and they were very much into the ritual bath, the mikvah. And with regard to their accomplishments, we've discussed perhaps the most significant was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they had scribed. And then we come to the Pharisees. In Hebrew, it's the Parushim, which means the separatists. And the Pharisees believed in the entire Bible and the resurrection from the dead and eternal judgment, etc. And these were the teachers. The Pharisees, by the time of Christ, it was a pretty corrupt lot. But by and large, when we look at Jewish history, these guys started off on the right foot. Pharisees are very misunderstood people, and we'll be looking more into a study of the Parushim, or the Pharisees. Suffice it to say that the Pharisees were not really the political leaders. They were teachers. They were the ones who taught the people the law, but they were so traditional they had trouble really getting the attention of the Romans. The Romans generally liked the Sadducees much better. The Sadducees were the ones who went for assimilation. These were the Hellenist types, the types that came to accept and love and even to be entertained by the Greek culture. And they were more amiable to the Romans, hence the Romans dealt with them. So it was really Sadducees who had main control most of the time. And there's a very, very serious frictions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which we'll be looking at as we study the intertestamental period more closely. In any event, these were some of the parties that were around during the time of the Roman occupation. We're looking at the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, we're looking at the Zealots, etc. Well, what happens is Rome's in power, and we hear about the revolt. Finally, the Jewish people said, look, enough's enough. And, of course, we know that Jesus, Yeshua, had come on the scene, and we read about the birth of Christianity, which we don't need to deal with a whole lot here. Just suffices it to say that Jesus appears on the scene during the Roman occupation, and people are upset because he doesn't pick up a sword and drive out the Romans. No, redemption is a spiritual process. One day in the future, the oppressors will be driven out. That's right, we're looking at what's going to be happening at the end of the tribulation period. Enough's enough, and God sets up his kingdom. But the Messiah's purpose for coming the first time was to deal with sin. But when he comes a second time, he's not going to deal with sin. He's going to be saving those who are eagerly waiting for him. When he comes a second time, he's going to be setting up his kingdom. He's going to be establishing his throne, and he's coming with a sword. But what happens is people didn't expect. Jesus took them all for a loop. He didn't pick up a sword. No, he preached the gospel of peace, and many, many Jewish people followed him. We read in the book of Acts where it says that even many of the priests became obedient to the faith. And we read it further in the book of Acts how it says Peter and James are encouraging Paul. They're saying, look how many thousands and thousands of our brethren there are who believed. This church was very, very Jewish, and it was considered, in fact, to be part of Judaism. Up until the year AD 70, these Nazarenes, as they were called, were just another sect of Judaism. That's the way they were perceived. Well, in any event, people were really getting upset with the Romans. The Romans really pulled some dirty punches, and we've heard about the terrible, terrible destruction of the temple, which occurred in the year 70 AD. Well, let's look at some of the events that came before that really caused the uprising, which ended in the demise of the temple. Well, in the year 62 AD, the Romans deprived Jews of citizenship following a fight between the Jews and the Syrians. And this takes place in Caesarea. And you should go there, by the way. When you see Caesarea, it's right there on the Mediterranean. And this was a Roman city that was built. Really, and this is where the heads of state stayed. And there it was decided that the Jews would lose their citizenship. And that was one thing. What are some other things? In the year 66 AD, Roman soldiers looted Jerusalem. They went in there and they sacked the city. But what happens is, in the year 66, Roman soldiers looted the city, and the city is then seized by a group of determined Jews called, you bet, Zealots, who didn't approve. They said, we're going to be the police force, we're taking over now. And in the year 66 AD, Roman military reinforcements from Syria were defeated by the Zealots. They came down to sort of get rid of the Zealots, and the Zealots defeat the Romans. It was a small band. The battle didn't take place in Jerusalem. It took place really just northwest of the city. Well, then what happens is the Roman Emperor Vespasian in 67 lands from Antioch. And he begins his process of quenching the revolt of the Jews. And in 67 AD, a Jewish garrison is massacred after a 2-month siege right near where he landed. Here, the emperor has his presence in the land, and he's going to begin putting down that revolt. Now, in the northern part, in the Galilee, by the end of 67 AD, Jewish resistance was just plain overcome by the Romans. The Romans landed up north, and they're moving their way down to quench this revolt. And finally, we know what happens in the year AD 70. The Romans have occupied Jerusalem. Titus is the son of the emperor, and he destroys the temple in the city. In the year AD 70, he just sacks it. And right before then, in the year 68, Nero commits suicide. Go and I'm glad to be rid of Nero. Nero was a real sick man. In fact, it was him, to move to church history for a moment. You know, one time what he did is, we're looking some 30 some odd years after Christ now, when we're looking at Nero. He used to take Christians and dip them in wax and stick them on poles and use them as torches to illuminate his garden. Real sicky. He really hated Christians, and he certainly wasn't very fond of Jews either. In the year AD 70, after Titus, after Nero, who again committed suicide in 68, what happens is that the temple is sacked, ending the period known as the Second Commonwealth. First Commonwealth was the first temple period, and this is the end of the Second Commonwealth. And of course, we're looking for the third, which of course will come. It'll be in the tribulation period. It'll be the temple will be rebuilt, and in the millennial kingdom as well, the third Commonwealth. In any event, so in 70 A.D., the Romans destroy the city and the temple. And then in the year 73 A.D., the last Jewish resistance was squelched by the Romans. And you have to visit that site too, the site of Masada. Just a couple of weeks ago, I walked down Masada. It's a big fortress on top of a hill, a huge hill. It was deemed an impregnable fortress, but Rome brought what they call their siege master with them, and they violated the gates. They built a ramp and overtook that fortress, which originally was built by Herod, by the way. Masada, it's just incredible. Like I said, you have to go there. Jewish soldiers are sworn in there, many of them, sworn into service. What happens is that the story of Masada, in a nutshell, is that there were some Jews left over amongst the resistance, and they went to Masada. And they were going to carry out, and were carrying out, actually, resistance against the Romans. And the Romans really had to teach an object lesson here. They had to just destroy them, lest they serve as a motivation, as a catalyst for revolt to take root again in the land. So they had to squelch the Jews at Masada, and for years they besieged that fortress. And finally, they conquer it, bringing a final end to Jewish resistance in that area for that time. And Flavius Josephus tells us he tells us about the siege of Masada, as well as the siege of Jerusalem as well. When the temple was destroyed a couple years earlier. If you want to read something that's now history, but then was prophecy, you need to look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 1 and 2. Here at the end of Jesus' ministry in the 30s A.D., just maybe 37 years before the destruction of the temple, Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, he's talking about the destruction of that temple. And if you want to turn to the Gospel of Luke as well, in the 21st chapter, beginning in verse 20 and reading onward, you'll read again where we see Jesus quoted in his explaining how that temple is going to go. And so it is for the time being, for a season, it did go. And in Masada there were 960 zealots, and there were about 5,000 Roman soldiers who encamped around the fortress. At one time there was as many as 10,000. And in the year 73, the Masada, the end of that particular movement, that particular resistance, was crushed. Well, following the destruction of the temple, and actually during the Masada siege, there was something called the Council of Yavne. I want you to note this, please. It was the Council of Yavne, which takes place between the years 70 and 90 A.D. And the Council of Yavne was chaired by a fellow named Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. And now what he does is he is a religious leader. He is the religious leader, the Jewish religious leader, and he has the task of re-establishing Judaism, reorganizing Judaism, because now Judaism had a problem. Once that temple was destroyed in the year 70 A.D., Jews now had a religion without sacrifice. And there was a mystery how we're going to be Jews when we can't be Jews according to Moses. We no longer have a sacrifice. For as much as some people might throw stones at me, being a Jewish person who've accepted Jesus, I at least have a sacrifice. That's why Jewish believers consider themselves to be biblical Jews. Not traditional ones per se, but biblical, because we still have our completion of the law of Moses in the person of Messiah Jesus. In any event, we're looking at Jewish people who don't really believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They get together and have a council called the Council of Yavne, and it's very, very, very important. Gosh, I don't know how to stress it enough, but when you look at a synagogue today, when you go into a modern synagogue, you're looking at things that came as a result of the Council of Yavne. For instance, and I want you to do this. If you have it, you go to a synagogue, and don't go there with tracts in one hand and a King James version in the other. Go there to learn something. There are things that can be taught. And what you do is, I want you to go in there and go to a service. And when you look at the architecture, the furnishings, now you can understand where it comes from. When you sit in the synagogue, you're going to notice in front of you there is a cabinet that has a velvet curtain draped in front of it. And in front of that curtain you'll see a light that burns perpetually. Now what happens during the synagogue service is they go and they open that curtain and they open this cabinet, the Aaron Kodesh. They open the cabinet, and in them you find the Torah scrolls. And the Torah scrolls, which are the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. It's the Bible. And the Torah has a crown on it and a breastplate on it. And they take the crown off and the breastplate off, and they take the Torah out, and the individuals kiss it, and then the Torah is read. So you'll say, okay, that's Jewish traditions, but what of it? Friends, you need to understand how all this is remodeled after the temple. Please remember, it used to be that there was a priest and a high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and he would wear the crown of the priesthood, and the priest would have a breastplate. But now there's no longer a temple, so the Torah itself is our priest, in a sense, if you will. It's the leader. And so it is that the Torah wears the crown and the breastplate. You'll look and you'll see there's this cabinet. There used to be the Holy of Holies, and in it was a cabinet that the commandments were kept in. And the Holy of Holies was a room that was behind a veil. And so we have a veil, and we open the veil, and we take the Torah scrolls out. It's sort of a reminder of the Holy of Holies. And there was a menorah. There was a light that burnt perpetually. It burnt continually in the temple, and that light is always burning in the synagogue to serve as a reminder of the temple. The point is that the modern synagogue and the synagogue service was in many respects designed after the temple that was destroyed. That's the way it was designed. Now, there were certain things that happened at the Council of Yavne. I mentioned the one, how Judaism was redesigned to be a religion without sacrifice. Another thing that happened at the Council of Yavne is the Minim were condemned. Remember I mentioned that there were those Jews who believed in the Nazarene, Jesus, who were called Nazareans. And they continued as a splinter group of Judaism. They lived and functioned as Jews and were considered as Jews, but they believed that the Messiah had come. Well, what happened during the Council of Yavne, these people were officially condemned and called Minim, which means a traitor. And in fact, there was the Shemona Esrei, or the 18 benedictions, which are repeated to this day in the Jewish synagogue. A 19th benediction was added to the Shemona Esrei, which was a curse condemning the Nazarenes. So up until the Council of Yavne, the Jewish believers were part of Judaism, but here there becomes a deep rift. Another thing that happens during the Council of Yavne is that the Greek text, the Septuagint, is condemned. That text is condemned, and the Masoretic text is held to be the accurate, inspired text of the Bible. Of course, the Greek text was the common text that people were using because many people spoke Greek. That really was, in many respects, a common vernacular here in the Greco-Roman world. But they didn't like that translation, and so it is that that text was condemned. Well, so what happens next? Well, what happens next? Well, I'll tell you what happens next. We're looking at developments in Jewish theology, so what happens next is that we discuss a person or two that had significant contributions to that. And I need to mention to you a fellow named Rabbi Akiva, very, very, very prominent Jewish sage. Who was Rabbi Akiva? He was the one that began putting together the oral law into what became known as the Talmud finally. He was the one that established something called the 6 orders of the Midrash. Let me explain to you, since we're looking at Jewish theology a little bit here, and the developments in the Council of Yavne, let me explain to you something. There's 2 things we want to discuss here. One is called the oral law, and the other is called the written law. Of course, we're familiar with the written law, which was given to Moses. It was written down at Sinai, and that's known as the written law, which was passed down. Well, according to Jewish theology, there was the oral law that was also given to Moses. And there's been this conflict in Judaism ever since the statement of the oral law was made. Just as there was the written law, which was to be passed down from generation to generation, many Jewish people believed that there is an oral law that wasn't to be written down, but it was passed down orally from father to son, and that too was passed down from generation to generation. The written law and the oral law. The Talmud is made up of oral law. Now, what is the oral law? It's traditions. Now, remember when Jesus told the Parushim, the Pharisees, you make void the word of God for the sake of your traditions. The traditions in the oral law are things that are aimed at putting the law into practice. The Talmud, the Jewish religious literature, it's kind of like the Ryrie study Bible of the Jewish people. It's commentary. Now what happens is many people have a Bible. You and I have Bibles in our homes, as do many people around this country. It's the best-selling book and least read book of all times. People have a Bible, but the Bible doesn't do us any good unless we apply it. We have to learn to apply it to our lives. Well, the Talmud is what applies the Bible to the life of Jewish people. And what happens is people got into revering the applications more than the word itself, to the point where the applications became the Bible, and people forgot what the original text said, but they got all wrapped up into what it takes to obey it. And well, Rabbi Akiva is right there at the beginning of the developing of Talmudic literature as he begins taking the oral law and writing it down. Now, later on, centuries later, there were people called the Karaites who said, "Wait a minute, these were a Jewish sect that really condemned the Talmud." They said, "Listen, if it's supposed to be an oral law, then then you're just obeying God by writing it down." Number one, and number two, the Karaites were kind of like the Martin Luthers of their day. They said Scripture only. They only went by the Scripture. And in any event, Rabbi Akiva in his day he really started off life as a nobody, not much of anybody, but then he married good. He married a relatively prominent rabbi's daughter. And he got himself an education. He started when he was, he didn't go to college when he was 18. I believe he was 40 when he began getting his education. And he became a great sage. And he was martyred, by the way. Oh, he died a terrible death. He loved Torah, and he really stuck up for the Bible. He stood for Scripture. And he began codifying the oral law. And as I said, the Midrash, which is part of the Talmud, began being codified by him. And it was really completed finally. Years later, a guy named Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, worked from, let's say, 170 to the year 220 A.D. and put together the Mishnah by the year 200. Now, what happens as we follow along in Jewish history is that, remember, the temple had been destroyed now many years earlier, and the focus for Jewish learning was no longer in Jerusalem, because the temple was sacked, and what happens is the center of Jewish learning shifts to the Galilee. So these prominent rabbis and things, it all takes place in and around the Galilee. And if you've been to the Galilee, perhaps you can see why. Things were so turbulent and troublesome down in Jerusalem, and things were so utterly destroyed. You couldn't go there and have time to reflect upon anything. It wasn't in an environment that was conducive towards study. Whereas to this day, you go to Galilee and you look at the topography, the geography of the land, the way the place is set up. It's so peaceful and placid up there, and it's beautiful. There's fresh water. There's beautiful little towns that are developed around the Sea of Galilee, and there's just the whole region itself really is. a real beautiful piece of real estate. And things were a lot more peaceful there. So academies began to flourish, and things were set up. Now, what happens finally? How long can a good thing keep lasting? Back in the year 132, there's a revolt from Hadrian. Hadrian was the Roman, and in the year 132, Simon was his name. Was the leader of a revolt against the Romans. Rabbi Akiva, going back to him again, what he does is he backs Simon and says that Simon's the Messiah. He believes that Simon, he's known as Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, and that's a term that makes reference to the Messiah. And what happens is that Akiba backs him. So Jews were fighting, and here was their Messiah who was going to finally lead them to victory. Well, Simon Bar Kokhba was no Messiah at all. And before it was all said and done, about 1 million Jewish people died. It was really, really, really a terrible, tragic time in Jewish history. Tragic time. I'll tell you another piece of tragedy as well. Up until when the revolt began, the Jewish believers in Jesus were fighting side by side in this revolt against Hadrian, because Hadrian was the instigator there. Hadrian was making life miserable for them, and he was unacceptable. And the Jews began the fight with Simon Bar Kokhba. But then what happens is when Akiba says that he's the Messiah, the Jewish believers say, "Wait a minute, we can't fight underneath that banner. We can't go along with that. We can't back that horse," and they pull out. And now you can see it. There's, in many respects, that the Jewish population looks at Jewish believers like they're cowards. What happens in the Roman siege of Jerusalem at 70 A.D.? There were no Jewish Christians there. They fled. They left. Why did they leave? Jesus told them to leave. I gave the gospel references where Jesus says in Luke 21:20, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, split. Matthew 24, Jesus told them what's going to happen to that temple. So they could see the handwriting on the wall. When the Roman armies appeared, they left according to Messiah Jesus' instructions. They left. And here we are now some years later, and here the Jews are fighting against Hadrian, and what's happening to the Jewish believers? They pull out as well. So they look at Jewish believers, they're cowards. It seems that these Jewish Christians want to say, we're Jews, but when the going gets tough, historically, the tough always got going. Zeigesund, off they went. Goodbye, good riddance. That's the way it's perceived. These are a bunch of cowards. They're not going to really stick with us. And so it is to this day. There are Jewish believers that stand and fight in the Israeli army. They'll serve as officers and as foot soldiers as well. And we think it's a real blessing that such is the case. In any event, Hadrian lasted. We were talking about the slaughter which took place in his day till the year 130 A.D. And then Antonius Pius, who is now the head honch in Rome, takes over, and he relaxes the yoke. And he's from 138 to 161 A.D., and things become a little easier for the Jewish people. And it's during this time when study really becomes golden. And a proverb was noted then that goes, never interrupt the instruction of children. You know, Jewish people have really been very, very big on the instruction of children. We were the first ones to have mandatory training for kids. Our kids got an education, and that's just the Jewish way of doing things. Study was golden, and it was a mitzvah to be teaching children. It's a shame today now that the profession of being a teacher really doesn't get its due. I mean, these people that make a life out of training our children and making them into productive, constructive citizens, it's a shame that it becomes such a low profession, because it really isn't. It's one of the highest of all professions. And again, never interrupt the instruction of children was the proverb of the day. Study was golden from 138 onward, and we read about Jewish greats. Judah II from the year 225 to 255. The Talmud, Jewish religious literature, is coming together. From the year 200 to the year 300 in Tiberias, there was peace. Tiberias was the center, and to this day you can go to Tiberias there. I just stayed at a beautiful hotel in Tiberias, and it's just a beautiful piece of real estate, and there was peace for 100 years there, from 2 to 300. It was just a lovely place to be. Now what happened is the Galilee was the center of learning. Now remember that there were many Jews elsewhere in the world besides the land of Judea. I always like to say this when people will say, why is it that the Jews killed Christ? I always say, time out, I got news for you. Most Jews never heard of Christ when he was around. What do you mean? Well, if you look historically, there were many, many more Jews in that day living in Babylon than there were living in Judea. And there were large Jewish populations in Alexandria, Egypt, as there were throughout the entire Roman Empire. Every Jew on planet Earth didn't live in Judea. And they think that every Jew on planet Earth was there at that trial saying, crucify him, crucify him. That really wasn't the case. Friends, if we look in our Bible, in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 3, it says that when they arrested Jesus, they came with torches and lanterns. Why did they come with torches and lanterns? Because they arrested him in the middle of the night. Why did they arrest Jesus in the middle of the night? Because earlier that day, thousands of Jews were running around the place saying, Hosanna in the highest, blessed be he that comes in the name of the Lord. We look at the events that precipitated Calvary, we'll find the Jewish population was ecstatic about this Messiah King, the Lord Jesus. And in fact, it was the Jewish response that was so positive to Jesus, that was the thing that got the Pharisees, that got the leadership bent out of shape and said, he has to go. He is circumnavigating around our authority. These people are following him and not us any longer, so we've got to do something. In fact, it was the positive Jewish response to Jesus that served as a catalyst for their decision to get rid of him. So Jesus is taken in the middle of the night. They come to arrest him with torches and lanterns because they couldn't arrest him during the day. I doubt the people would have allowed it. And Jesus was taken in the middle of the night. In the wee hours of the morning, he was sent off to a monkey trial. I got news for you. Before the sun was high in the sky the next day, Jesus was on Calvary's cross. Question: do you think the average Jewish person really knew what happened? What happened that the average Jewish person got up for work and he was riding into work in the morning and he turned on his radio and it said, "Newsflash, Jesus has been taken, trial set for 9 o'clock." I mean, how did the people know? What did they do? They rode into Jerusalem and there was a guy standing there in the corner yelling, "Extra, extra, read all about it. Jesus Christ has been taken captive, trial set for 9 o'clock. Extra, extra." Did people know? They didn't have communication systems like we have today. People didn't know. Jesus was set up to this monkey trial, and he was condemned, but it wasn't the will of the entire Jewish population. The entire Jewish population didn't even know, and that's my point. The average Jew in Israel didn't know what was happening, really. And never mind, there were large, large populations of Jews elsewhere. We go back to the book of Ezra, where we read about the Jews who come back from Babylon following the captivity. There were only 50-some-odd thousand Jews who returned. Many, many more stayed in Babylon. Historically, there was a large, large Babylonian Jewish population, and as these academies were getting established in the Galilee, here let me finish chasing my rabbit and get back to my point. As the academies were being established in Galilee, scholars would come from Babylon. Rabbis would come and they would study in these academies and then return to Babylon. And what happened finally is they began ordaining rabbis who were from Babylon. So these people would come to Israel, they'd come to the Galilee, they'd study, they'd get ordained, and then they would return to Babylon. And we'll see how there was real competition between Babylonian scholars and Jewish scholars. This comes a little later. We'll be looking at that. In any event, let's catch up with some history with some Jewish leaders. From 225 to 255, Judah II was the sage of sages for the Jewish people. From 255 to 275 was Gamaliel IV. From 275 to 320 we come to Judah III. Now let's look at our dates here, 275 to 320. Now during that period of time, what else do we see? As we're in and around the year 320, what happens then? Well, I'll tell you what happens then. In the year 311, the now emperor of the Roman Empire decides to become a quote-unquote Christian. You bet it, his name is Constantine. Now, Constantine is a very interesting person. What happens is in 311, he has this dream, this vision of seeing supposedly the cross in the sky, and this means that he is to become a Christian, and indeed, when he becomes a Christian, the whole empire becomes, quote, Christians. You've heard the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Well, let's face it, if the emperor gets this bent on Christianity, and if you want to get any place in the empire, guess what? You are going to start getting interested in Christianity too. You're going to want to favor the emperor. And so it is that Christianity began becoming what's known as a state religion. Now, prior to this, the only people who really became Christians, these were people who meant business about it, who had an experience, by and large, of salvation through the new birth. Of course, that's the only way to really become a Christian. And granted, there's some nominal ones around, and there are always heretics around selling their bill of goods. But by and large, people who took a stand for being a Christian were taking a risk, because they weren't in the popular movement. Believe me that, of course, I mentioned a little earlier about Nero used to torture Christians by using them as candles for his garden and burning them alive. And that was just one of the kinds of tortures. Never mind the way that we were food for their lions. Never mind the way that we, the ways that we were used in the arenas to provide sport. Christians were just murdered off in many ways. And so the only person that was going to take a stand for the gospel usually was someone who meant business about it. But what happens now is once it becomes popular, it becomes in vogue to become a, quote, Christian, you don't know who your friends are and who they aren't because everyone's a Christian. And now, instead of having a personal relationship with God and that being the basis for entrance into the church, now everyone becomes a, quote, so-called Christian. And once the floodgates are opened up to admit anyone into the so-called church, well, you bet it, people came into the church bringing all their unregenerate attitudes with them. In fact, whereas when we look in the New Testament, we see a church which is composed of Jewish people. This Christian business is a very, very Jewish state of affairs. It's sad today we look and we see there's the Jews over here and there's the church over there, and there's a great chasm, a great void between the two, an inseparable gulf. I mean, a gulf that can't connect the two. I mean, they're just miles apart from each other. But when we look in the Bible, we find Jews and Christians hand in hand, man. It's one and the same thing in many respects. How is it that the Jew became so alienated from the gospel? And how is it that Christianity became so un-Jewish-like in its approach to things? Well, what happened is in the year 325, Constantine, who's the emperor, who really is pulling the strings for the Roman Church now, which became known as the Catholic Church. Remember how the Roman government wanted to rule the world, Rome? Well, Catholic means universal, and this became the Roman Catholic religion, the universal Roman Church. Well, what happens in the year 325, a council is convened called the Council of Nicaea. And there were good reasons for convening this council. They were dealing with different heresies that were creeping into the church, and it became very necessary to explain exactly who Jesus is. Now, we hear people say, and it's true, that the word Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible. It's true the word isn't, the concept, the doctrine certainly is. And the Nicene Fathers found it necessary to hammer out the doctrine of the Trinity. Well and good. They did other things at this council. What happened is I'm reading to you now it's a translation from the Latin to English, and this is part of a letter of the emperor that was sent to all those that weren't able to be present at the council. The council lasted for a long period of time, and not every clergyman was able to attend it, so they printed up this tract and had it sent around to those who couldn't attend. And let me read you, this is dealing with Jews. It says, we ought not, therefore, to have anything in common with the Jews, for the Savior has shown us another way. And consequently, in unanimously adopting this mode, we desire, dearest brethren, to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews. And I go on. How can they be in the right, they who, after the death of the Savior, have no longer been led by reason, but by wild violence, as their delusion may urge them? And I go on. It would still be your duty not to tarnish your soul by communications with such wicked people as the Jews. It is our duty not to have anything in common with the murderers of our Lord. Can you imagine that? This is the Council of Nicaea. Amazing. You know, historically there were 20 or so Jewish bishops around at the time. None of them were invited to the Council of Nicaea. We can see here where where anti-Semitism really became church policy of this now institutionalized church. And I read from the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers, page 54, and it's also found in the book of Eusebius. I'm reading to you. It really comes out of the Easter question. Verbatim comments from the Council of Nicaea, the Jewish people. So it is that instead of the Jewish people becoming the people of the church, the Jewish people were hounded by the church, and it became official policy that the church should separate themselves from the people whom they put it as the detestable company of the Jews, the murderers of the Lord, etc. Well, so in the year 325, the councils convened, and what happens is eventually, as we can see quite easily, anti-Semitism really does become church policy. So much so, by the year 400 AD, of course, there were still Jewish believers around in the church who believed in Jesus, and these were Jewish people, but they still wanted to maintain their Jewish roots. These people were considered apostates by the year 400 AD. The point being that you find Jewish believers around today that want to be Jews. We would have all been burned at the stake a few hundred years ago. We were apostates. We were just, the church just hated us so much that we were history. Talk about history. Let's move on now to our second segment. Our first segment dealt with from the exile to the year AD 500, and now we're going to cover another large span of history, which is we're going to be looking at Judaism's developments in Jewish history from the year 500 to the year 1800 AD. And let's just do a quick review. We'll sort of recap what we've discussed. We see that there were problems in the Holy Land. We've talked about how there was wars and what have you because of revolts against the Romans. And first the Jewish people, the center of learning, the center of everything was Jerusalem. Following the destruction of Jerusalem, the center became the Galilee. And then because of Jewish revolts, the Roman armies came in and landed up north, and they swept down and just overtook the Galilee. And they marched down to quench the revolts and what have you. There were all sorts of problems, and Judea was just occupied territory, and it certainly had no tranquility. There was no peace in that land. And when you're in a constant state of flux and turmoil, you're not able to sit down and concern yourself with the studies of Scripture and what have you. Not only wars, but from a Jewish theological point of view, there's no problem with being rich. It says that if you have money, if you're secure, then you can be more so able to concentrate on spiritual things. And there's a grain of truth to this. I mean, if we have a hungry stomach, it is hard to be sitting down and concentrating on studying the Bible. I'm not talking about being rich, but we should attend to our physical needs. And in so doing, we'll be able to be a lot freer to be able to look to other things as well. In any event, from a Jewish point of view, things were so difficult. There was so much flux. There was so much turmoil because of the wars. There was no tranquility. Jewish people weren't able to really sit down and study Jewish theology, so it really lacked. It really lacked. Meanwhile, back at the Babylonian ranch, talked a little bit earlier about how Babylonian students used to come to the Galilee. They'd come to Israel and study, get ordained, and they'd go back. And they would return to Babylon, which was a much more amiable atmosphere for the Jews. Jewish people had been there a long, long time, and they sort of were left undisturbed. The land of Israel is such a strategic point. Every new world power that appears on the scene enters into, the Israeli arena of conflict. It seems that such is the case, but Babylon is much more further removed, and there was basically tranquility in Babylon. They didn't have all the wars that happened in Judea. And so it is that today, when we come to religious literature, the Babylonian Talmud, as it's called, is much bigger than the Yerushalmi or the Jerusalem Talmud. Because in Babylon, the Jews were able to further study and develop and write more commentary and the like. And so it is that as there once were academies scattered throughout the Galilee, now the prominent academies shift to Babylon, and then there are various academies in the city of Sura, Netardea, Pumbedotha, to name a few. These were some of these academies there that were very, very prominent. And so it is that Jewish people were able to live in relative peace in the land of Babylon. But then you know what happens? As we move on to the year AD 570, a person is born in 570 who is going to change, who's going to have a significant impact on the history of not only his immediate area, but indeed the entire world. In the year AD 570, a peasant was born by the name of Mohammed, who was at an early age orphaned and raised by his uncle. Was never really educated. He was self-taught. He used to be a caravan boy, attend to the camels and what have you. But at the age of 25, he married a widow who had some money. She had some money from her previous husband who had died, and he had married her. He seized the opportunity, and before you know it, he himself became a trader. When I say a trader, I don't mean a trader in the sense of a Benedict Arnold. I mean in the sense of trade, buying and selling, moving merchandise all over the world. And what happened is Muhammad got to travel. And he traveled and he ran into Jews and he learned about Jewish ideas and Jewish theology. And then he also ran into Christians, what we want to call Nestorian-type Christianity. He ran across that. And he picked up Christian ideas, plus he had his own Bedouin kind of ideas. And you know what he did? He put it all together and formed a religion of his own. And the story goes that in the year 610, while he was meditating, an angel appeared to him, and voila, the beginning of the Muslim faith. Well, from 610 to 622, Muhammad went about preaching, but you know what happened? He was preaching in Mecca. He gathered himself around 10 to 15 converts. That's what he had to show for that 12-year period of time, and he's thrown out of Mecca. They figure he's just a menace. They don't know where this guy gets off with all of his revelation business, but in Mecca they want nothing to do with him, and he's thrown out, and that's that. Well, listen, to add insult to injury, they wouldn't hear him, they wouldn't admit him, nothing. He didn't have a very good start. And what happens is that Muhammad winds up in the city of Medina, which is about 250 miles north of Mecca. And there, he added a new twist to his sermons. He preached a subject of religious toleration. And there, while people were so firm and they wouldn't flex at all, he was the minority religion, and you know what happened? He got attention. And by the year 624 AD, he now has the majority religion. He's preaching a message that's very palatable to the average bear there in Yellowstone Park. They like him. And his message is quite palatable to them. And in the year 620, by the year 624, he is the majority religion. In the 620s, in the late 20s, he gains control of the entire Arab peninsula. In the year 630, he returns to Mecca with sabers. He tried once with his words, and it didn't do very good. He comes with swords, and after the war, he's got control. And he is the caliph. The caliph is a Muslim word for an Arabic word for someone who's a prophet and a ruler. And so it is that now Muhammad, the peasant boy who made good for himself, now sits on the throne, and he uses the sword to become quite great. By the year 635, he has Damascus. 636, Syria and Israel are under his control. 637, things are just spreading left and right. Islam eventually spreads from India all across North Africa. It crosses the Mediterranean over into Spain. Now, when I talk about the spread of Islam, I'm not talking about 144,000 evangelists that went out preaching. I'm talking about guys that had a saber in one hand, they had a spear in one hand, and a sword and a shield. I mean, these were warriors that went out and conquered for Allah and then forced the people to convert. So-called Christians have tried that route, but this is the exclusive. This is Muslim evangelism. As I said, these people are just taking over more and more territory. India, North Africa, they cross over to Spain. And were it not for Charles the Hammer of southern France, his name was Charles the Hammer, a military leader, he checked the Muslims. He stopped them there. They would have just crossed over and conquered Europe as well. Well, what happens is that really, in the year 632, Muhammad had died. And new leaders take control, and eventually they take control of Babylon and puts an end to the tranquility there. The once placid atmosphere of Babylon is now under the control of the Muslims, who, by the way, at first they were very harsh and hostile towards the Jews. Muhammad himself was really bent against the Jews. He tried to preach to the Jews who wouldn't listen. So once he became in power, he had a score to settle, and really they were quite harsh with the Jews at first, but eventually things settled down. Really, the Muslims were much better to the Jews than were the Christian church throughout in European history and what have you. Of course, it was bad. I mean, there was a lot of problems, but it was livable anyways. But what happens now, we had a Jewish center of learning in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was wiped out. It moved to the Galilee. The Galilee was wiped out and moved to Babylon. Now Babylon isn't the peaceful environment anymore, so the Jewish center of learning eventually moves to Spain. Of course, Spain has a strong Muslim presence. In the year 1038, Babylon goes down, and Spain... in the early 900s, we have a lot of Jewish scholars in Spain. Jews learned Arabic. They took on the language. And Spain became the center of learning. And they became quite civilized. They made usage of the post office. The sages would sit there in Spain and pontificate, and they would send letters that would go back and forth to the different synagogues in different Jewish communities, and that's where they'd go for their seats of instruction. They would go to Spain. Similarly to how we find in the New Testament, the apostle writes an epistle to the church at Rome. Well, from Spain, they'd write their epistles to the synagogue in Damascus, etc. Spain became the place. But of course, how long could things last in Spain? We're familiar with the Crusades. We've heard of problems with the church finally in Spain when the church comes to power. There was a lot of problems. I could go into the various crusades, but let's save that for another time. We can do a study on the relationship between the institutional church and the Jews. Suffice it to say that from Spain, as a result of the crusades, certain families would flee Spain, and a particular family moved to Egypt. And part of this family that moved to Egypt was a fella named Moshe ben Maimun. Ben is the Hebrew word for son. Moshe is Moses. Moses ben Maimun was his name. Moses, the son of Maimun. He became one of the greatest sages ever of Judaism. His name was Maimonides, as he was called. He's more affectionately referred to as the Rambam, which is an acrostic for rabbi. Moshe ben Maimun. We just call him the Rambam. One of the greats of Judaism. At 23, he wrote his first draft of the Luminary, which was a commentary, a beautiful commentary, where he deeply discusses how one can use philosophy to explain Jewish thought. This is the Jewish theologian at his finest here, Maimonides. It was he who hammered out, in his 10th chapter of the Sanhedrin, he formulated the 13 creeds of the Jewish faith. To this day, this is what Orthodox Judaism holds to, adheres to, as the basis for traditional Judaism. There's 13 principles. One of them is we believe with perfect faith in the resurrection of the dead. We believe with perfect faith in a coming of Messiah. We believe with perfect faith in the unity of God, etc. The first 5 principles of the creed deal with God. The 6th through the 9th principle deal with the Word of God, and the 10th through the 13th deal with the end, if you will, coming of Messiah and the like. From Maimonides' point of view, God is a perfect unity. And also, from his point of view, God can't take on the accidents of matter. In other words, he doesn't believe John 1:14 that the Word could become flesh and dwelt among us. Now, he directed his works, Maimonides directed works against the Trinitarians, a belief in 3 gods, not in Christianity. He directed himself against atheists, against philosophical atheists, and against the antinomians, those who stood for abolishment of the whole law of Moses in particular. Maimonides himself was a physician, and he was quite prominent as a physician to the Sultan. And so it is we've looked somewhat into the life of Maimonides. Maimonides was the patron saint of the Yemenite Jews. We can go to Israel today and you see the Yemenite Jews. Yemen were the only people who really memorized the Old Testament, and really it was Maimonides who used to write them and encourage them. What happened is that they were being oppressed by the Shiite Muslims. We've heard of them. The Shiite Muslims were really in control, and the Yemenite Jews were down there and had to deal with them. And he was encouraging them to continue faithful to the Torah and what have you, and he just became their, as I said, patron saint. And so it is that Maimonides claimed, by the way, that Jesus and Mohammed both paved the way for the coming of Messiah. From his point of view, he considers the contribution of Jesus and Mohammed both, because these beliefs, according to him, brought large sums of humanity nearer to the knowledge of God. And from his perspective, please understand that Christianity takes from his point of view, takes the Western Gentiles and points them to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as does Muhammad introduces them to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with Moses is just a prophet and David and what have you, but at least it gets them in the arena of the Old Testament. And for that reason, he says that that these people paved the way. He was, by and large, very tolerant towards... Rambam was considerably tolerant towards the Jewish people, as were other Jewish sages as well, were tolerant towards Jewish people who were believers in Jesus. Well, now what happens is Rashi comes next. Rashi was another Jewish sage who lived from the year 1040 to 1105 AD. He was born in Troyes, France, and Rashi was a famous Jewish scholar as well who... in fact, today, we look at Isaiah 53, and a Christian person will look at it and say, this is talking about the Messiah. And a Jewish person will look at it and say, no, according to Jewish theology, it's talking about Israel. No, according to Jewish theology, it wasn't really talking about Israel. It was Rashi who changed that around. I remember doing some research when I was up in Moody. I did a paper on Rashi, and I was checking through sources from the Jewish Publication Society and elsewhere, and it says in there in just plain black and white, we'll be looking at this later on in our studies, how Rashi was the one who said, look, we used to interpret this as Messiah, but because of the Christians, let's just say it means Israel. Look, I don't want to throw stones at Rashi. I can understand his point of view. In Rashi's day and age, there were crusades. There were people murdered by so-called Christians. The way Christians used to witness then is the knights would just come with their swords and say, look, Jew, you become a Christian or die. And that's the way it was. And needless to say, Jewish theologians were really bent out of shape about these so-called Christians. Never mind. And so what happened is they assumed these postures that were really hardened against Christianity, and people interpret that to mean, look, what we can read those writings today, and people will say, well, how hard-hearted are those Jews towards the gospel? No, they're not hardened towards the gospel, they're hardened towards Christianity. And if you had to suffer beneath the yoke of Christianity for as many years as have the Jew, it wouldn't be hard to understand why. And that's the reason why I always like to stress that it's important for you. And when I say you, yes, I mean you. I mean, who's listening to these tapes? I mean, I safely assume that the people at the other end of this microphone, the people that I'm talking to, that I'm teaching, are people that really love the Jewish people. You gotta love the Jewish people to sit down and undertake a study like this. You're gonna have to remember a lot of this stuff I'm teaching you, and I'm throwing a lot of information at you about the Jews, and I know you love the Jewish people. That's why you're listening. That's why you have your pen in your hand right now and you're taking notes. Well, God bless you, dear friend. It's really important. I want you to really go out of your way to practice kindness to the Jewish people, and you go back in your church and you be an emissary for that message. You go back into your church and please just tell the people how they need to be loving towards the Jewish people. There's a debt that needs to be paid, and the church has just got to really show love to the Jew. The Jewish person has to see that real Christians love Jews. It's an important message they need to understand. Well, in the year 1096, the first Crusades got going, and they would have killed most of the Jews were it not for a Christian who did stand up. He was a Catholic bishop. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux, and while the ignorant mobs were just looking to destroy every Jew they could get their hands on, he was the one that stood up and said, no, God would not have us do this to God's people. In fact, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, listen, there would be many, many less Jews on planet Earth today were it not for his courage in standing up for the truth. Well, we know about different anti-Semitism and prejudices and what have you. A lot of it was fueled by a misguided zeal by so-called Christians. In the 1100s, Germany expels the Jews. And in the year 1492, a very, very famous expulsion of Jews. It wasn't only, the old saying, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, he wasn't the only one sailing in 1492. All the Jews in Spain sailed as well because they were expelled from the country. They were given 120 days to get out. And so it is, we're looking at a Jewish life here where we started off in Rome, we moved to Babylon, we saw in the 7th century the rise and the strength of Muhammad. We're going into the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. We're up to 1492 here, and we're seeing, just reviewing some Jewish greats, and we're just taking a general look at life in the promised life for the Jewish person throughout the lands of Babylon and Spain and into Europe. Now, here we are, we're looking in the 15th, the 16th, the 17th centuries. There's Jews in both Eastern and Western Europe. Remember that going back to the time when Rome was in power, Jews scattered then throughout the whole world. Jerusalem was destroyed, and there were some Jews in the Galilee, but Jews by and large were really dispersed. It's called the diaspora, the dispersion. And Jews were scattered throughout the earth, even before Rome. Remember that when Paul goes on his missionary journeys, that there's Jewish communities in these Gentile cities that he's preaching in. Jews had traveled far and wide, and by the time we're here in the Middle Ages, we're looking at Jews that were in both Eastern and Western Europe. And by and large, Judaism was very traditional. If you've seen, you go to Israel and you go to what's called the Western Wall, you see a picture of Jewish people with these curls, these locks, beards, dark, coats and what have you, these Hasidim, the pious ones, these ultra-Orthodox Jews. It used to be in many respects that this is what Judaism was like. There were always those who assimilated, but by and large, the average Jew was very religious, very traditional. They looked different from the average person. They talked different. They had a different belief system altogether. They kind of stuck out. And this was normative Judaism. This is pretty much the way it was. And indeed, this in many respects is the way that God intended it. Remember, in the Bible, he chose the Jew to be a separate, very distinct kind of person. And so it is today. Traditional Jews reflect that quite well. And the traditional Jew of today really is wears the clothing with the dark suits and what have you of the middle-aged Jewish person. In Eastern and Western Europe, we find a very traditional Orthodox kind of Judaism, but you know what happened is it didn't remain that way for very long. What happens is we have something called the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, and I suppose that the French Revolution marks the final throwing off of the yoke of the Middle Ages. Enough is enough. During the Middle Ages you had the upper class and the peasants. Either you were rich and you weren't. Of course, we saw the rise of a middle class, but there was still this big aristocracy around, this big bureaucracy of nobles and what have you that were really oppressing the peasants. Things weren't very democratic. If you were born in a rich home, good for you. If you were born in a poor one, you were in big trouble. And there was no peace, there was no help, there was no hope. Everything was corrupt from the church on down. There were true Christians who appeared on the scene, but by and large things were bad. The French Revolution brought about a whole new system, a whole new ball of wax altogether. The French Revolution was fought under the banner of freedom for all men. Yes, even Jews. What happened is people were tired of being oppressed. They said a man should be treated with dignity, with respect, and were tired of being pushed around by the bureaucracy which cared nothing. Here the common person was oppressed beneath oppressive leaders, and the peasants decided to revolt, and they said freedom for all men, and this even applied to Jews. Now Napoleon, to give an example here, he made a deal with the Jews. He says, listen, I'll give you full citizenship, and you can even have your own French Sanhedrin. You can have your own French Jewish governing body. All I want you to do is give up your interest in returning to the land of Israel. And what happened is Jews did. Many Jewish people did. What happened was this is a time when the world was in flux during the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, things became real democratic for a season. They said, listen, anybody can be treated like a somebody, not just by virtue of your birth. So after the French Revolution, discrimination was in check. Jews were allowed in schools for the first time, and Jews were allowed to get into professions. Prior to the French Revolution, during the time really when the church ruled with an iron hand, Jews were pretty much confined to ghettos. Jewish people weren't allowed to do much of anything. They were just really suppressed real hard. Jews had their own living quarters, the ghettos, in their own special part of the cities, and Christians weren't really supposed to mingle and talk with the Jews. The Jews were the Christ killers. They were the bad guys, those who killed the Lord, and the Christian church was really to have nothing to do with them, except for the purpose of telling them how they killed Christ and they need to repent, etc. So the Jews had their own neighborhoods, and they were walled into their ghettos. They couldn't really own land. They couldn't really do much of anything. But following the French Revolution, the ghettos came down, and the walls came down, and Jews were allowed into society. They were allowed to get an education. They were allowed into the professions. So now what comes with it is a real rift amongst the Jewish people. There had been the traditional Jew who lived there in the ghetto life and lived and worshiped God and had their traditions and just standard normal Judaism. And again, Judaism is designed, if someone's really going to be obedient to the law of Moses, they are going to stand out like sore thumbs and not be liked. Let's face it, the law of Moses isn't easy. It isn't fun. It's a joy. The Scripture calls it a joy, but it's tough. It is tough. Not to walk around without having the corners of your hair being cut, and to have those curls, to wear those beards, to wear those outfits. People look at you and laugh and go, ha, 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 look at you. You stand out like a sore thumb, you dirty Jew. There were Jewish people that said, look, following the French Revolution, Jews were allowed to make it in life, and there was a conflict, a rift in the Jewish society. Some Jews said, listen, here we are, we're able to be accepted by the Gentiles. Let's give up these traditions that make us so distinct and separate and make them hate us. Here we are, we're Jews, we eat different food than the Gentiles, we speak a different language, we dress different, everything. Let's become like the nations, and then they'll accept us. So it was really out of a desire to be accepted. What happens is a movement is born in Judaism called Reform Judaism. And here they throw off the wearing of yarmulkes. They don't speak Hebrew in their synagogue services. Sometimes they meet Sunday instead of Saturday. They're trying to be like their neighbors because they want to be accepted. They want to be accepted. And so what happens is you have a rift amongst the Jews. There's Reform Jews that say, look, you traditional Jews are too far behind the times. You're polarized. You're locked into a system of worship that was developed hundreds of years ago and doesn't apply today. You guys need to become more modern, and you need to get with the spirit of the day and time in which we live. Well, that's what the Reform Jews said. The Orthodox Jews said, wait a minute, you guys are destroying all of our foundations. You're forgetting where you came from, and you're going to be lost in this sea of new ideas. Well, who was right and who was wrong? They both had good arguments, and a movement was born to try and accommodate the both of them called Conservative Judaism. And so it is today that we have Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Jews. Conservative Judaism tried to take the best of both worlds and incorporate it into a system of worship. Well, we can go into all this at some other point in time when we're looking at Jewish theology, and indeed it is a course of study for us. Here, suffice it to say that there were conflicts in Europe. There were Jews who wanted to assimilate and become just like all the people once they had opportunity. They just wanted to mesh in society and give up all their Jewishness. And there were Jews who wanted to maintain their tradition. But you know what happened? No matter what the Jew did, they lost. Those Jews who tried to become like all the rest of the nations, they were disdained for it. They were disdained for it. In fact, Hitler said, look at the Jews, they're taking over everything. Now you can't tell who is a Jew and who isn't. They pretend that they're not Jews. Here they've gotten rid of their Jewish customs and their Jewish outfits, and now they're intermarrying our people. And before you know it, their bloodline is going to destroy the whole Aryan race. So the Jews that wanted to become just part of society and forget that they were Jews, they were hated for destroying society. And those Jews that remained separate were hated for being so elitist that they wouldn't join the party. So it was really a no-win situation. You know, it's a hard game to play when no matter what you do, the cards are dealt against you. And so it is that the Jewish people find themselves between a rock and a hard place. And such is generally, I suppose, if you wanted to sum up life from the year 500 to the year 1800, it was a period of shifting and developing. And the Jewish person, by and large, was between a rock and a hard place. It's a good way to put it. It was, for the Jewish person, it was learning how to live with tsuris, with difficulties, learning how to live with pain, living how to live in unpleasant times. And now we come to our third point in history from 1800s to the present. And this in and of itself can be a very, very exhaustive subject. I mean, we could get into this for hours and hours and hours, because this really forms the backbone for the thinking of the modern Jewish person. Here we are in the year 1986, soon to be 1987. We're looking at the 1800s, so we're not shooting back very far. We're looking back to the history that shaped the day and age in which we lived. We're looking at the background that shaped the Jewish person, different things that went into making Jewish people think the way we do. Well, to review basically, as we look at our third point, it helps us to review somewhat of where we've come from. We went back all the way to the Bible times. And we look from the Bible days to the times of the exile. And we covered that thoroughly in our study of Old Testament survey, and we reintroduced it again here in our study of Jewish history. But then we really picked up and began putting new information together in our first period, which was the formation of Judaism. And we looked from the year 400 BCE, before the Common Era. We looked from 400 to 500 AD, and we tried to trace the development of Judaism. And then we've looked at, from the year 500 to the year 1800, we've looked at Judaism and its many developments, tracing it, Judaism from the Promised Land itself into Babylon. We've looked at the rise of Muhammad. We've gone from Babylon to Spain. We reviewed some Jewish leaders. We looked at some important parcels of history, and onward we've gone. Next we come to from the 1800s to current, and as we open up the pages of history in the 1800s, we find a word that stands out in describing the situation for the Jew in Europe. What was it that they contended with more than anything else wherever they lived during the 1800s? It was a word that I've already mentioned. It's called anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism. In particular, now we'll look at anti-Semitism in Europe. Now let me ask you a question, and it seems like a stupid one, but it's a good one. Are Arabs anti-Semitic? No, they're not. You say, what do you mean they're not? No, Arabs are Semites. They are descended from that same people. We're both from Abraham. Both the Jews and the Arabs alike. Arab people are not anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic is a term that's become to mean anti-Jewish, but it's not quite accurate. Anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness was quite prevalent in Europe. Those who were traditional Jews were hated for being different, and those who were Reformed Jews were hated for assimilating and trying to mix breed amongst the nations and what have you. Now, what I want to do is give you a little bit of insight into European anti-Semitism. Some of the countries that were just much more so known for anti-Semitic type things. We're looking at Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Poland. And just to give you some of the terrible events, in 1918, 900 Jews were forced into the sea and drowned in the Ukraine. In 1918, all the Jewish elders were massacred just south of Odessa and Yalta. In 1932, in Greece, a ritual murder charge was brought against the Jews. They used to claim that Jews would murder Christian children and mix their blood to make Passover matzah, to make unleavened bread. And it was a charge that's come down throughout history. And it's really kind of pathetic. Nonetheless, in Greece, riots broke out in 1932. And in 1917, in Greece as well, Jewish schools and synagogues are destroyed by fire. And of course, we know 1920 to 1933, in Germany, Hitler is preaching his brand in Munich of anti-Semitism. From 1933 to 1939, small anti-Semitic movements culminated in local anti-Jewish violence in imitation of Germany. So what happens is in both France and Great Britain, anti-Semitic movements begin, and there's anti-Jewish violence. They're imitating what they're seeing their hero do in Germany. And there were problems as well in Spain and elsewhere. So just basically a review of some anti-Semitism. It was really noted throughout. Anti-Semitism is nothing new. People were jealous of Jews who were remaining Orthodox, and they were jealous of Reformed Jews too, because Reformed Jews had gotten into all the schools and academies and what have you. Now people notice that about Jewish people. They go, why is it Jewish people are all why do Jewish people become professionals, doctors and lawyers and what have you? You know, friends, when you look in the Bible, Jews traditionally were farmers. When you look at ancient Israel with the Jews in it, it's an agrarian society. Jews were farmers in there. Well, how do we get from all being farmers to not even knowing how to spell farm? And such is the case in America. You don't find Jewish farmers. You find Jewish people in the professions, doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, but not farmers by and large. Why is that? My wife has her undergraduate degree in sociology, and she could give an explanation. I'll tell you what happened. In the Middle Ages, Jews were farmers as well. But friends, there isn't a single country in Europe that the Jews were not thrown out of. Now put yourself in a Jewish person's position. Here you are, you're a farmer, you have a land, you got a couple horses, you got a couple plows. The government comes around and throws you out of the land, confiscates your goods. Not only do they confiscate your crops, they take your land, they take your horses and your plows, and they throw you out. So you have to go to another country and start all over again. And you do start all over again, and then that country comes along, and they confiscate your land, your plows, and your horses, and off you go. The same thing happened. A Jewish merchant would have a shop somewhere, and they confiscate all of his goods. Soon it became practical for a Jewish person. They said, listen, what we need to do is get our education in our heads. We need to get our profession in our minds, and that way they can never take it away from us. Listen, if you're a doctor and you're in Germany and they throw you out of Germany, guess what? I don't care what country you move to, you're a doctor there as well, because the human body is the same in France as it is in Germany, and it's the same in England as it is in France. A body's a body, and Jewish people learn to get their education in their heads, and no one can confiscate that. And that's one of the things that's really impressed upon a Jewish person. With regards to the subject of education. Well, now, anti-Semitism is a sad thing, but it really did exist. And let me just give you some background information on the subject of anti-Semitism. There was a work published called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, it may be that you have never heard of that before, but now I'm going to introduce you to it. In 1903, a Russian newspaper published and this thing called the Protocols, which was the supposedly newly discovered secret plan that the Jews were meeting together to take over the world. And actually, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was an old play that someone adopted with Jewish characters. And allegedly, the Jews had this plot to take over the world, and the Protocols were supposedly the minutes from their meetings for world dominion. And these Protocols of the Elders of Zion became a focal point of anti-Semitic beliefs and actions for many years. 40 years to follow. Over 40 years, actually. Over 40 years. And it really comes from Spain, is where the first story in 1903. Well, actually, not even Spain, and it was in Russia, I'm sorry. Well, in about the year 1840, in the city of Krakow, the Jews were said to have held a secret parliament to discuss the domination of the world. Now, let me just give you some background on the Protocols. In 1840, in Krakow, the Jews got together and had this conference and discussed how they would take over the world. Well, in fact, in 1944, the German propaganda ministry declares that if it were possible to checkmate the 300 secret Jewish kings who rule the world, the peoples of this earth would at last find their peace. Isn't that sick? They're saying, listen, it's a playoff of the Protocols of Zion. The German propaganda ministry is saying, if we can only get all these guys, then the world will have peace. It's the Jews' fault that the world's in a mess. In 1934 to 1937, court proceedings declare that the Protocols to be ridiculous, nonsense, and immoral. This happens in Bern. The Protocols were just really quite popular. In fact, let me give you cities where new revisions. In Madrid, Spain, in 1933, they produced many editions, as they did in Barcelona, Spain. In Rome, it was produced and printed about the Jewish plot. In Belgrade, in Bucharest, in Budapest, in Vienna, in Prague, in Leipzig, in Berlin, in Warsaw, in 1920, 1923, 1930, and 1934, new editions were printed. In London, in both 1920 and 1921, many editions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were printed, wherein they were uncovering, and they thought it important to show the world about this Jewish plot. It happened in Oslo, it happened in Stockholm, St. Petersburg, in Moscow in 1911 and 1917, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were printed. And the whole thing, really, in many respects, the devil was trying to sell the world on the ideas that the Jews were interested in taking the world over. Jewish people aren't interested in taking the world over. Jewish people are interested in being able to live in peace and raise their children happily. Well, what happens, we're looking at Europe, and as I told you, anti-Semitism is rather prevalent. Jewish people tried to assimilate, and assimilation failed to bring acceptance. Jewish people found themselves in a no-win situation. If you were an Orthodox religious Jew, you were hated. If you were a Reformed Jew, you were hated. Jewish people felt secure, and it seemed that there was no place that they could hang their head and feel secure, until finally it dawned on the Jewish people, we need our own homeland. Now, I'll tell you, there was a movement called Zionism, where it didn't have a very strong beginning. Zionism, where Jewish people were getting excited about the idea of returning to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Now, Israel at this time was in ruins. It wasn't in very good shape. Jewish people were excited about the possibility of returning to the homeland. In particular, we're in France, and there's something called the Dreyfus Affair. Now, we're going to look at the Dreyfus Affair in a little bit of detail. What happens is France, which is supposedly the civilized country of the world, in 1894 to 1906 has very strong anti-Semitic feelings when Dreyfus, who was the French Jewish army officer, was accused of selling military secrets to the German government. What happened is Dreyfus was railroaded. He was accused of selling off secrets and being a traitor. And it was really ridiculous. It was almost a joke. But what happens is the French court finds him guilty, and he's sentenced to Devil's Island. He's later exonerated. He's later set free. Now, there was a reporter at this trial, and his name was Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a reporter at the trial, and in 1894, he's looking at this thing and he goes, "What a railroad! This is ridiculous. This is really, really ridiculous." And what happens is that he says, look, enough's enough. Because here he is, he's a newspaper reporter from Vienna, Austria, and he's looking at this trial, which is taking place in France, which is supposedly the most civilized country in the known world at that point in time. France was noted for its culture, for its civility, and here, if this country can be so backwards and be so gross towards the Jew, he's saying the Jew has no hope. So after covering the story, he went there as a newspaper reporter. He left there as a fervent Zionist. And he said, listen, there's no hope for us Jews anywhere. We get the axe no matter what we do. And here you take this beautiful soldier, Dreyfus, and who was railroaded. He was such a loyal Frenchman. When he was let out of prison later and exonerated, he went and rejoined the army. He was such a loyal Frenchman. And he's saying if France can railroad one of her children just because the person's a Jew, then there's no hope for us anywhere. We need to have our own homeland. And what happens is he is in 1894, he becomes really finally the spokesman for Zionism. He says enough's enough. We need our own homeland. Well, let's look a little bit at the subject of Zionism. Let's trace its history a little bit. In the year 1860, a conference is held in Prussia, in the city of Thorn, to discuss the possibility of a Jewish home in Israel. And in 1861, in Frankfurt, the Zion Society is founded. We're looking at the very, very beginnings. And in 1884, in Katowice, in Prussia again, in 1884, the Lovers of Zion movement holds their first conference, and we'll be hearing about them a little later. Well, of course, 1894 comes along, and it's in Paris, France. The Dreyfus trial takes place, and that's where Theodor Herzl, after covering the Dreyfus affair, becomes really impressed with the fact that Jewish people need a homeland. And in 1896, in Vienna, Austria, Herzl publishes the Jews' State, a work wherein he urges the Jews to seek their national home in Palestine. I mean, he's really into it. He's writing things. The written word really went far back then. I mean, the printing press really had a way of getting around, and people were listening, especially those of the Russian Jews. In fact, in 1896, in Bulgaria, Herzl was acclaimed as the Messiah. That's taking things a little far. In 1897, the Lovers of Zion movement, which we mentioned a little earlier, was revitalized in Odessa in Russia, and Herzl is its new president. And a fellow named Yushishkin, who's a disciple of Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am means the voice of the people. He was kind of like the spiritual leader. He's the spiritual guru of Zionism. Zionism really is the movement that served as a catalyst for the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel, and Zionism itself really isn't a very religious movement. It's a very socialistic type movement. In fact, it's not socialism in the communist or in the Russian sense of the word. In fact, but the Russians thought it was. When Israel became a nation, the Soviet Union endorsed the country before America did. So as soon as Israel declared her independence, the Soviet Union stood right with it because they thought that Israel was a natural to be a Soviet satellite. But they just didn't really understand the Jew. In any event, in Odessa, Russia, in 1897, the Lovers of Zion movements revitalized. The dream is rekindled. And the first Zionist Congress was held in 1897, and they urge a meeting. They start really pressing in Basel, Switzerland, for a homeland for the Jews. In fact, and they met again in Basel in 1898, 1899, 1901, 1903, 1905, 1911, 1927, and 1931. People meant business. Not everybody did. In 1904, Herzl went to visit Pope Pius X, who was unsympathetic towards the idea of the Jews having their own homeland. He wasn't interested. In 1901, Herzl had an audience with the Sultan in Constantinople, and he asks that Israel be a Jewish national homeland, but they weren't interested. The Sultan wasn't very, very helpful. But the point is you find people working. They are working and looking because the Jewish person said, look, enough's enough. We need our own homeland. No matter where we are amongst the nations, we have a rough go of it. No matter what we do, no matter where we go, we get hassled, we get abused and molested, and we need our own homeland. Now, we're going to be looking at the subject of Jewish people returning to the land of Israel. Suffice it to say here, for our purposes, that the interest sure was brewing for a movement of Jewish people to return to the land of Israel. Well, by now it should be abundantly clear that there wasn't a lot of opportunity and hope for the average Jewish person in Europe at the time, and we can see why Jewish people would be especially thinking in terms of returning to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. Now, with regards to returning, even so, when the first aliyahs, when the first waves of return began coming, it all began first from the Eastern European Jews. We're talking mostly around Russia. Now, perhaps we've seen, maybe you've seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof. Remember, if I was a rich man, la di da 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 da. Remember how Tuvia was forced to flee, and such was the case in Russia. The Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, wasn't quite the same for the Jew as it was in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, Jewish people were kept. Even after the Enlightenment period had come and gone, Jewish people were kept in the Pale in the ghettos, such that there was really no good opportunity available. So when the opportunity for Israel came about, most Jews went for it. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, where the tide had taken a better turn for the Jew, who was able to assimilate more so into the professions and the like, Jewish people were much more comfortable. That being the case, when the Jews first began returning to the land of Israel, it was mostly Eastern European Jews. The Western European Jews were still a bit too more comfortable. Even with the waves of the Eastern European Jews, which were more religious than Western, Zionism, by and large, at this point, was still a pretty secular, non-religious movement, to the point where, once upon a time, it was offered to the Zionists, instead of taking the land of Israel, why don't you settle for Uganda and make Uganda a homeland of the Jews? And they almost went for it. They almost voted it in, were it not for the influence of the Russian Jews who said, wait a minute, time out. No, we have to go back to the land of the book. Uganda Shmanda, God gave us the land of Israel, and so it is. That's where we're going to return. But again, were it not for their stand, Jewish people today that are going to the homeland might be flying into Ben Gurion Airport in Uganda. But of course, the Bible predicts the God's dealings with men, and it was Israel that's the land, and so be it. Such was the case. Well, when Jews first began coming into the land of Israel, they encountered first the Turks. The problems were really with the Turkish authorities. The Turkish Ottoman Empire had control of what they called Palestine. Now, we hear the term Palestine used a whole lot. I really don't like that term because really it comes from a Roman designation, Capitolonia, where we get the word Palestine. It was always called the land of Israel, the land of Judea, and that's the case that I like to use here. I don't like to refer to it as Palestine. The Turks had control of the land that they called Palestine, or that we call Israel, and following World War I, the British, who defeated the Turks, and now the land of Israel was part of the British Empire. Remember the old expression that goes, the sun never sets on the British Empire? The British Empire was so vast it was said there was always a place on earth where the sun was shining on British territory, and such was the case, and the land of Israel, the homeland of the Jews, was part of British territory. And we'd think now that finally the land of Israel is in some civilized hands and the Jews will get a good deal. Well, that's what many people thought. In fact, they were led to think that by, in 1917, there was something drawn up called the Balfour Declaration from Lord Balfour, wherein it says, and I quote, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." This is a quote from the Balfour Declaration, which is a legal document, in effect, where the British congratulates the Jews for the land of Israel and states that they have every intention of helping them accomplish their objective of having a national homeland for the Jewish people. Well, I believe it was Menachem Begin rather it was Ben Gurion who said with regards to the British, one of the things that was so frustrating with the British is they would say one thing and do something else. And such had always been the case in trying to work with the British, where they would lie. And that certainly was the case in dealing with the land of Israel, dealing with the Jewish homeland. The British really did a very, very terrible job. They lied quite frequently. They'd say one thing to the Jews and another thing to the Arabs. And so it was that the Hebrew, the Israelis, were never really able to work with them. In fact, the British were just so cruel to the Jews. And we're going to get into that. We're going to be looking in particular at another study of the history of modern Israel, and we're going to go into it in a little more detail there. But suffice it to say that from 1917, from the end of World War I, it was official that the land of Israel belonged to the British people, and Jewish people were beginning to come to Israel. We're going to be looking at the exact at the dates and times when we were seeing a lot of immigration to the land of Israel in our study of the history of modern Israel. But suffice it to say that Jewish people were returning to the land of Israel prior to World War II. Now, as we're doing a study of Jewish history, it behooves me to do a study to mention the subject of World War II. It's a very, very horrific subject. I don't really enjoy talking about it. I'm a German Jew. Seif is a German name. My father and my mother's family were both from Germany. My mother was actually smuggled out of Nazi Germany as a youngster. And I don't really fancy the whole subject, but I just, sometimes I feel like Jeremiah. I have this burden within, and I just got to get it out. And so it is that I do talk about the Holocaust, but not, it's important for us to learn it, and of course I don't have a whole class on it, but as we're discussing an overview of history and the Jews, it behooves me to spend some time on the subject, and that's what we're going to do right now. I want to talk about the subject of the extermination of Jews. And what I want to do is just go through main countries in Europe, and I want to tell you how many Jewish people they had in the country and how many of those were exterminated from the year 1941 to 1945. You'll note, interestingly enough, that most of the Jewish people that were exterminated from 1941 to 1945 were not on German soil. You know that the Jewish people are not idiots. Whatever faults we have, stupidity generally is not one of them. And Jewish people could see the handwriting on the wall, and many Jewish people fled Hitler. and they'd flee to other countries, but what would happen is the Third Reich expanded and took over more territory. They'd catch up with the Jewish people and butcher them accordingly. Well, okay, let's begin in the country of Germany. From the year, again, we're looking at the subject of Jews that were killed from the years of 1941 through 1945. Now, of course, there were another million or so, not even in the figures, who died of starvation and other such things. But in particular now, we're looking at those who fell prey to Hitler's Germany. In Germany, there were 250,000 Jews from 41 to 45, of whom 180,000 were slaughtered. In Denmark, there were 6,000, of whom 100 were slaughtered. It's really quite incredible, and I should get into that at a later date. And in fact, I will in another course about what happened in Denmark, how Christian really stood for the Jews and saved 6,000 of them. In Holland, there were 140,000, of whom 104,000 were massacred. In Belgium, there were 85,000, of whom 28,000 were murdered. In France, there were 300,000 Jews, of whom 65,000 were slain. In Italy, there were 120,000 Jews, of whom 9,000 were deported and murdered. In Yugoslavia, there were 70,000 Jews, of whom 58,000 were murdered. In Bulgaria, there were 48,000 Jews, of whom 40,000 were murdered. In Romania, there were 1 million Jews, of whom 750,000 were murdered. In Hungary, there were 710,000 Jews, of whom 200,000 were murdered. In Austria, there were 70,000 Jews, of whom 60,000 were murdered. In Czechoslovakia, there were 81,000 Jews, of whom 60,000 were murdered. In Poland, there were 3 million Jews, of whom 2,600,000 were murdered. In Lithuania, there were 140,000 Jews, of whom 104,000 were murdered. In Latvia, there were 100,000 Jews, of whom 70,000 were murdered. And in German-occupied Russia from 1941 to 1944, there were 2.5 million Jews, of whom 750,000 Jews were murdered. We should also note as well that the Germans also killed over 6 million non-Jewish civilians as well from the years of 1939 to 1945. And these died as well in the concentration camps and slave labor camps and the like. And amongst those civilians who perished were Christians, were sincere people that refused to go along with the slaughter of the Jewish people. Well, needless to say that the Jewish population really took a beating in World War II, as did the rest of the world, by the way. Some people maybe get upset. They go, why is it that the Jewish people raised such a fuss about the Holocaust? They weren't the only people killed in World War II. There were 20 million Russians killed. There's plenty other millions of Jews who perished in World War II. Why do the Jews focus on their number? Well, it's true that because of Hitler's treachery and Japan, who joined ranks, who hopped on the bandwagon, there were, of course, many more people killed in World War II. But the thing that makes the Jewish extermination stand out so much, is that it really was a concentrated effort to kill a race of people. These weren't soldiers; these were civilians, and they were just. It was the only case in the war, really, where there was a concentrated, organized mass effort to just blot these people off the face of the earth. And it was an extermination of an entire race of people. The crime being that they are of the Jewish race. Had nothing to do with bearing arms in opposition to Hitler. It had to do with the fact that they were just plain Jews. Well, given that there was such murderous barbarism going on in Europe, one would think, well, why isn't it a lot of Jews fled and made it into Israel? Well, let me tell you, I've gone over some countries. Let me tell you something about the Jewish people that fled and made it into, I don't know if I mentioned Greece, 67,000 Jews lived in Greece, of whom 60,000 were slain. Well, of the Jews that reached the land of Israel from 1933 to 1934, let me tell you the numbers that from these various countries. It's very minuscule. Poland, 12,000. 8,000 made it from Romania. 8,000 made it from Germany. 6,000 made it from Czechoslovakia. 3,000 Jewish people made it from Hungary. 3,000 Jewish people as well made it from Bulgaria. 1,000 Jewish people made it in from Greece. 800 Jewish people survived and managed to make it in from Yugoslavia. From Lithuania, 600 Jews managed to come to the land of Israel. From the USSR, only 600 Jews made it into Israel. From Italy, only 500 came. From France, only 300 came. From Holland, only 200 Jewish people came. And from the country Latvia, a sum total of 100 Jewish people were able to escape and make it out. Now, why is it that the Jewish people have such a hard time getting out of these countries and getting into Israel? Well, you have to understand that that Israel was in the control of the British, and the British flatly would not let them in. That's just to put it in a nutshell. Not only that, but in the year 1940, the German government interned 30,000 German and Austrian Jewish refugees as enemy aliens. Can you imagine that? They were fleeing Hitler, and the British government interned them as enemy aliens. Well, look, in France in 1944, 8,000 Jewish children were saved from death. They were hidden in convents and private houses. And listen, I want to give credit where credit's due. My mother was from Heidelberg, Germany, and she was smuggled out by nuns. And I'm eternally grateful for that, of course. Well, now, the British are in control of the land of Israel, and the Jews are really having a rough go of it all over the world, all over Europe. And so many were killed, and so few were able to get out in those final years. Of course, prior, those Jewish people who saw the handwriting on the wall, many came to Israel. Not many. Jewish people came to Israel. Jewish people managed to flee to America. But remember, when we're looking at the 30s, when Hitler's, rising to power, and when Hitler's making a name for himself over there, America was beset with her own problems that she was interested in. America had their own, we had our own depression, and the American government was reluctant and would refuse admittance of Jews. Jews just flatly weren't allowed into the country. There were quotas. There was really no place for Jewish people to go. Hitler used to boast. He'd say, listen, we hate the Jews and you know it. If anybody else wants them, you can have them, but nobody else will take them. Nobody else wants them. And, Hitler was right. The Jewish people just could not find there was no place to run to. There's just no place to go. There's an incident called the USS St. Louis. It was a private boat that was chartered by a couple hundred Jews who had visas to leave and go to Cuba, and they sold all their possessions and everything, and the boat gets to Havana, and the government, the authorities just won't let them board. But by now the whole world knows. The world knows what's happening with the Jews in Europe. In Germany, everybody knows. Every single person knows what's going on. But they wouldn't let them in Cuba. And so that the boat, the St. Louis, steamed slowly up towards New York City, trying to cut a deal that they could go to America, and the Americans wouldn't let them. So this boatload of Jews had to go back, and most of the people that were on that boat eventually died by Hitler. It was amazing. They were right here. They could look out over the railing of their boat and see the Statue of Liberty. But they just plain were not allowed to disembark. In fact, Navy ships, Coast Guard ships came to escort them to make sure no one jumped overboard and came to America. They were after their own interests and not that of Christ Jesus, as the statement goes. People just plain didn't care. America had her own problems and wasn't interested so much in the plight of the Jew. And while there were Jewish communities that were begging the government, listen, don't worry. See, the American government had problems. There was a depression, there were financial problems, and they didn't want increased burdens on the federal government. And the Jewish community said, listen, we've never been welfare recipients. Listen, let them over here. We'll take care of our own, thank you. They still wouldn't do it. When you think of Jewish people, you don't think of people leeching off society. You think of people contributing towards it. And the Jewish community said, listen, we'll take care of our own. We'll take care of these people. And even so, it was just really, really tough for a Jew to get into the United States of America, as it was elsewhere in the world. In particular, we're looking at the land of Israel that was controlled by the British. And during the war, just boatload after boatload, people were sent back. There was no place for them to go. No place for them to go. Because the British just didn't help the Jews. They wanted to side with the Arabs instead. They wanted to please the Arabs. But, there were problems between the Jews and the Arabs in the land of Israel, so what else is new? And there were problems with the British, and we've discussed somewhat of how British were really kind of cruel. When we look at some of these Jewish greats, let's just take Menachem Begin, for instance, the Jewish leader. These guys were soldiers, but they didn't make a name for themselves. I mean, many of the old Jewish resistance fighters, they didn't make a name for themselves fighting Arabs. No, they made a name for themselves fighting the British. That was the case. You go to Israel now, one of probably the most beautiful, the most palatial accommodation for tourists in Israel is called the King David Hotel. And one of the wings of that hotel were blown up. That was the headquarters for the British government. It was blown up with some 80 British officers were dead. Jewish people were underground, what some people call terrorists. You look at the early days of the Jewish underground, and people say these were terrorists. Well, the difference is, no, Jewish people weren't terrorists. There was a war going on, and they were fighting the British occupation forces. This was an underground army versus armed soldiers, not an underground army killing unarmed civilians. And Jewish people had declared war against the British because the way the British were just so cruel. Finally, what happens is, of course, World War II comes to an end. And incidentally, during the war, the Jews fought with the British against Hitler. And then after the war, you'd think the British many of the Arabs fought with Hitler, and the Jews fought with the Allied forces, and in particular with the British forces. And even so, after World War II, the British resumed their policy of slighting the Jews and attending to the Arab population, which was a bit hostile towards the Jewish people, to say the least. We're going to be looking more at the relationship between the Jewish people and the Arab Semitic people of the land and what have you, as we study the history of modern Israel. But suffice it to say here that there was friction, as there is to this day. But we're looking at the friction not so much between the Arabs, we're looking at the friction between the Jews and the British, as Jewish people now are moving back to the land of Israel. Any way they can get in, whoever can make it in, they're coming. How did Israel become a nation? What happened? We hear that, and rightly so, that 1948, that year in May, when Israel declared her independence, believe me, that was prophecy come true. That's Bible prophecy in its finest. That's Bible prophecy coming true in our day. What event precipitated that independence? How did it come about? Well, I'll tell you. Here we are. It's World War II's over now, and people are licking their wounds and rebuilding. And in particular, Jewish people are still trying to get into the land of Israel, and come 1947, they're still having a tough time doing it because the British just won't let them in. I mean, putting salt on a wound. You had a boatload, it's called the Exodus, a boat of about 4,500 survivors of World War II, Jews. And they come to, there they are, the shores of the land of Israel, and the British will not let them disembark. They say, no, listen, we have reached our quota of Jews, and you guys just can't come on board. There were they didn't get permission to come off the ship and go to Israel, and there were all sorts of problems, and this got world attention. And finally, the British said, look, we can't take it anymore. Enough's enough. We don't want to mess with the Jews. And they take it to the United Nations, which declares on November 29th, 1947, the United Nations declares that Israel has the green light to become a separate nation. And so it is that in May 14th, 1948, Israel declared her independence. May 15th, followed by war. There was always war. And in fact, there's been many wars since. Now, we've just looked at something of the British. And again, most people don't know that, but the problems at first was with the British. Well, with that, I conclude, having finished my notes on this subject of Jewish history. We'll be looking at more exact information with regards to the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in our study of the history of modern Israel. We're going to be looking at the return and the rebuilding of Israel in particular. But suffice it to say here that we have just covered an overview of Jewish history. It was quite an ambitious task because we went through so much material, and we did it so quickly and so briefly. But nonetheless, even though it was brief, I don't want to apologize too much for it, because it certainly is my prayer that it's been a blessing for you. You've just been given a lot of information to digest, and I hope that you work with it and retain as much of it as you possibly can, because it helps you better understand how God has been at work in the world and dealing with the Jewish people from the days of the Jewish inception, from the days of the calling of Abraham, when God indicated his plan for Abraham and his progeny, his offspring, as you follow the history of the Jewish people from the days of Abraham to present. Now I hope that you're blessed as you can better understand what God has been doing in his keeping the Jewish people. And what a blessing it is to see how God preserves over so many thousands of years. Mark Twain wrote a book. Actually, it started off as an article in the latter part of the 1800s. He takes a vacation and he goes to Austria, and he notes that anti-Semitism is quite it's a plague in all of Europe. He says he goes to Austria and he just notes how people don't like the Jews. And Twain writes articles which became a book which was entitled "Concerning the Jews." and Twain notes in there, he goes, many civilizations have come and gone, and they've come and they've held their torch high for a while, the Persians, the Medes, the Babylonians. But where are these ancient civilizations? They held their torch high, they ruled the Jews, and they ruled the world, and they faded into the stardust. They're no longer with us, but the Jew is still here. We have outlived everyone. People have crushed us, but no one's killed us. The Jews always made a comeback. And Mark Twain asks the question, he goes, what is the secret of her immortality? Why is it that the Jew just lives on? Well, I'll tell you why, friends, because God said it would be. That's the best reason of them all. It's just a good example of God's preserving power. And we've traced the Jewish people through thick and thin. We've looked at how different powers have persecuted the Jews, how sins have hurt the Jews. But in all, the people comes back, because the people is a people with a destiny, friends. One day, his kingdom will come, that literal kingdom, the millennial kingdom. And so it'll be that all Israel then will be saved and have a personal relationship with God through the Messiah, Yeshua. Well, God bless you, friends. Amen.
Well, now you understand something about the history of Judaism, and well, you might. You know, it's an interesting point to consider. The way the Bible is organized, there are 11 chapters at the beginning of it that deal with God's dealings with men before the Jews, which is to say, before there were a chosen people at all, God tried different ways of dealing. There was different spiritual economies with God dealing directly with men, the simple law of the garden, the covenant with Noah. All of it came in the end to the Tower of Babel, to the idea that men were going to promote themselves right up to God's level is the idea there. And it seems as though right in that chapter we read about Terah, and we start to see Abraham come into the picture in Genesis 11. In other words, it seems as though because of men's irreverence, God stopped dealing with all men everywhere and invented a special people of his own. And then beginning with Genesis 12 and the call of Abraham, he deals with this people exclusively to the last page of the Bible. You might say, is it exclusive? In the New Testament epistle to the Corinthians, doesn't that deal with the Greeks? Yes, indeed, but it deals with them in terms of the Jewish Messiah, to get them, in effect, into Judaism, into New Judaism. What we call Christianity is extended Judaism. It's not different from Judaism, it's Judaism with the Messiah added. And so it is still the story of the Jewish people. And in Revelation, of course, the calling out of the 144,000, the kingdom being established in Israel, the Antichrist understanding this point very thoroughly and putting his headquarters not somewhere else but in Jerusalem, going into that temple, not into some Buddhist temple or something to claim that he's God. He too honors the chosen people. And finally the Lord comes, and in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, as Zechariah tells us. From Genesis 12 on out to the end of the Bible, to the end of the kingdom and the beginning of eternity, is, in a sense, a Jewish history. So it's well that you have taken up this subject and taken this course, and I know that you have been thrilled, and you found a lot of things to love in here, as I have, and any Bible person who's undertaken a history of this remarkable chosen people. Now, we've left the development of the nation of Israel as a separate course because we felt you'd appreciate us dealing with it independently. where we could spend more time on that subject, because that is really relevant to our lives today. Well, study hard, go back over these tapes, look at your notes, prepare for a good exam. You know a wonderful thing now. Keep your notes and make reference to them in the future. Keep this knowledge current. Thanks for taking this course. Drop us a note and tell us how you liked it, and I enjoyed very much participating with you.